much time do we have? Can I get 1 minute?
Yeah, go ahead. We're going to get started in 1 moment.
Thank you.
I am.
All right, so Commissioner, just to, before Suzanne gets started, turn my mic on. Just as a brief introduction, I should say, to our work session. This work session was scheduled because we knew that after we passed the ordinance, that there would be a number of details that we would have to work through. And after the ordinance was passed, Suzanne was directed to work on getting some more information, to have some conversations with Laura, follow up on a number of questions we had asked during that process. And we said that we would plan a work session where we could all come together and work through some of those additional details, knowing that we needed a little bit more time in order to gear up for the implementation of this new policy, but also in preparation for accepting applications. We had a similar conversation a little bit when we talked about passing a moratorium, knowing that we needed to work through a number of details. And so today is really to give us that time. We may need to come back together based on some questions that may come out of today's work session, but hopefully we'll be able to work through the agenda that Suzanne has put together. I know she has a lot of questions that she wants to work through with us. We were all given information. I don't even know if it was late last night or early this morning.
Late last night.
Commissioners, I don't know about you. I haven't had a chance to read it, so I appreciate that the information was put together for us, but I haven't had any time to read it, and we've all had full days, many of us starting at 7:30 a.m. this morning. So just know that even though you provided us this information, I can tell you I haven't read it, and I'm assuming some of my colleagues haven't either.
And I totally anticipated that. So the presentation is geared towards the fact that you probably didn't.
Okay,
so
good. Thank you.
It's okay. It's all right. We'll get there.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor, so much for that introduction. We have a busy afternoon planned for you, and what we did as a tool, put together this medical marijuana work session discussion guide, because we thought that would be the best way to kind of go through each step and kind of walk you through it. So the agenda for this afternoon, we're going to focus on the ordinance requirements first. There's several questions from a policy standpoint that we'd like the Commission's feedback on regarding what you would like to see potentially changed or not. This is trying to get feedback from you. So however, which way you want to send it to us. About an hour for the VEDA discussion, Voluntary Equitable Development Agreement, with a break in there. And then discussion about the application process and community engagement. So that's, and they kind of build on one another as you'll see, as we start to have these discussions, there's kind of a cascading effect when we get to the application process. So wanted to kind of just share with you how all these pieces start to fold together. This list of things on the agenda is really a compilation of feedback that we've received from interested practitioners, lawyers, and realtors, neighborhood and business district representatives, and members of the general public, particularly immediately after the passage of the ordinance in July. In fact, right after you passed the ordinance, those 3 days then, so you passed it on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, we received over 200 contacts from the public asking about this, and actually on average, poor Landon, he usually carries the whole brunt of it, receives 30 to 50 contacts a day on marijuana. So we've really kind of, one whole FTE right now is working on just marijuana alone, and then actually we have a contract staff person that's been helping. The good part about that is that we've received a lot of input. So we have a lot of feedback, a lot of questions, a lot of desire for clarifications, and that's really what you're going to hear today is kind of, we're hearing this, we're seeing this, we're getting this kind of feedback, we're seeing some issues that we want to talk with you about and share some stories and really get additional direction. So that's the purpose for today. The goal for me, if we're talking about goals, the longest as far as process goes is the ordinance amendments, because they have to first go to the Planning Commission before they can come back to the City Commission. All of the other work that we would be asking of you that we would need direction on and what would guide what we do is policy. And it would rest with the City Commission. There's one potential ordinance, but it would be a City Commission ordinance. So from a timing standpoint, the first thing out the gate is if we can resolve some of these zoning questions, that would be desired. And then the other piece is you will be seeing other things in the future, for example, the VITA, or if it's an application process policy. So there's a couple different things that you'll see again, but wanted to cover what our priority for today was, which is why I started out with the ordinance requirements. What you have in front of you, the nice colorful sheet that we've used and handed out to the community is we have had some exchanges, not just these one-on-one conversations that we've experienced, but we've also been talking to neighborhood groups. Last week we had a neighborhood association meeting and talked to neighborhoods to find out where their concerns were and to try to provide some clarity to the rules that were adopted in July. This is a little one-pager kind of infographic that describes it, and so I think it's a useful tool for today's discussion as well. The middle one, where you see separation requirements, you'll see in the blue on the left-hand side of that diagram, and I don't know if I can show it, but when the City Commission adopted the ordinance, you allowed for waivers for parks and playgrounds, religious institutions, and substance abuse programs. One of the #1 items that we're finding that we have issues and questions around are the waivers and that process for waivers. And so I will start with private waivers. We have not had a lot of feedback about the substance abuse program waiver, but we have had questions and concerns from religious institutions. So religious institutions have been, some of them have been bombarded with waiver requests, including requests for exclusive waivers, where the separation distance requirement is waived for just one operation and not others. So they're saying, I want this exclusive deal, sign only with me for this waiver. Such requests are sometimes accompanied by offers of substantial amounts of money or other compensation, which has anecdotally led to great concern among religious institutions' leadership, as well as reports of attempted bribery and other abuses. So Landon is hearing these and can speak more directly if you want him to. But we've even had someone come to the counter and say, I want to establish a church in a neighborhood so then I can be paid by the marijuana business who want to locate here so I can benefit from the waivers. So this is a little crazy. You're going to hear some fun things. So it's been an interesting ride. So we have the way, as the ordinance was adopted, the ordinance requires the Planning Commission to consider the potential detrimental effects to a sensitive land use that may be caused by a marijuana facility located within 1,000 feet of that use. So they still have, even if the church says they're comfortable waiving, the Planning Commission still can decide. but that 1,000-foot number for religious institutions should be viewed as fluid because of that waiver process. So we did do a full research of other communities that have waivers or don't have waivers, particularly in the state of Michigan. Landon did an entire review of that. The only area where he found the possibility of a waiver was by an by a unit of government granting a waiver to their own property. Not private entities granting a waiver to another private entity. So he has a long list. How many communities did you look at?
Probably 15,
20? And we could not find where waivers are possible or used. So for this one of the questions that we have, and I have on the board, but then also in front of you, the possible solutions to this. So remove the waiver possibility for churches, remove churches from the required separation distances, just pull them out and not have them subject to that. Develop opt-out language for those individual sensitive land use locations that wish to be excluded from the waiver process. So we have had churches, for example, call and say, how do I get them to stop calling me? I don't want to be contacted. I want them to leave us alone. And right now we don't have a method. We just say, we're sorry, they're going to contact you. Remove waiver possibly for one or more marijuana license types. So maybe it's possible for a transporter, but they can't have a waiver for a dispensary, for example. Develop guidelines for granting a waiver and or limits of consideration, or no changes, that we keep the ordinance as is and allow the waiver to play out. So that would be the first thing that we'd be asking you for direction on. From staff's perspective, we would recommend keeping, sliding the waiver, the possibility of the waiver from could be waived to not be waived, and just keep the 1,000-foot separation distance. But that's up to you guys as to what we would like to do.
Do you want feedback on each one?
Yes.
Or do we want to go through all of them?
I want to go one by one, and we'll just kind of...
By one.
Yep.
Okay, all right. So I'll start with Commissioner O'Connor.
I think we should remove the churches from the required separation distances.
I thought you might say that.
Well, if medical marijuana, it's a medical use, and I don't see what the sensitivity, why a church should be treated differently than anything else. I respect the idea of having a separation distance of 2,000 feet between uses for a concentration of impact, but we're only, I think this was only developed and put in place as a tool to try to limit the number of dispensaries that, or medical marijuana facilities that exist in our community. And I just, this isn't a bar, this is a pharmacy, and so why we wouldn't say if CVS needs to have a 1,000-foot separation distance from a church. There's some pretty bad stuff that gets sold at CVS that it's got pretty detrimental impacts on our community. So I see no reason why we should have this as a requirement.
I will open it up for other comments or questions. Commissioner, I know you have repeatedly said that you see this as a pharmacy. I don't necessarily think everyone agrees with that.
I understand that, and I also, unfortunately I was unable to be at the last meeting when you guys put a moratorium in place, which I was certainly not in favor of. I feel like there's a lot of reasons around that. I'm glad to talk about them now, but I do feel like we are preventing, the longer we kick this down the road, we're preventing people from, our community from accessing the medicine that they need. And it's unfortunate that we're doing that. I think we have the capacity to do this, and I'm sorry that the planning staff has been burdened, but that's an unfortunate reality. When a busload of customers shows up in my business and we're not prepared for it, sometimes you have to figure it out. And so,
thank you for sharing your perspective. We know that this is
always glad to do so, man.
This is a sensitive land use that we need to take seriously, and we talked about that last time. And I know that you keep equating it with pharmacy. However, others see it as a could have a potential negative impact on their neighborhood. So I just want to make sure that we recognize not everyone agrees with that sentiment. So Commissioner Lanier, did you want to?
I just want to keep the language as is. Okay. And I think that, Suzanne, I know your office, if they're trying to, I'm sympathetic with the faith community that is experiencing inundation and phone calls and contacts to start the process of getting a waiver, but I think that this is necessary for all the reasons that we discussed when we first put this provision in the policy.
Okay.
And I think some of those provisions were tied to the discussion about making this policy similar to our alcohol policies. And so I think that was how the language, this is how we started having the conversation about the language. And if we're having the conversation about pharmacies, then we would also need to look at the number of pharmacies that we would have in city limits and compare the number of pharmacies that offer thousands of prescriptions to this one pharmacy that offers one type of prescription in different forms. Then there is there is no balance with that either. So I think we should be careful with how we're lumping those things together. But one thing we do agree on is I didn't support the moratorium too, for different reasons, obviously.
That's not what we're voting on today. That's already been decided. So let's talk about waivers.
Unless a motion was made.
I'm going to go to Commissioner Jones and then Commissioner Repart, because I do, we have multiple options before us. And I do think we need to be sensitive that we created, I personally was not prepared for churches to be inundated by people contacting them trying to get a waiver before we're even accepting applications. So that's a consequence of a decision that we made, and I'm glad that it's been brought to our attention. So Commissioner Jones?
Sure. Suzanne, this information may have been provided already. If so, I would just ask if you would pass it along. But I'm curious to get a ballpark idea of how things would change if it wasn't 1,000 feet, but instead 500 feet. How would, in terms of availability of properties?
So it would, I'm looking at churches here. Oh, wait, those are granted. It wouldn't have a substantial difference. I would say a swing of 10, probably 10 possible sites.
10, so 10 additional?
Dispensaries.
Additional, okay.
If from a hard 1,000 to a 500, yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Others, Commissioner
Yeah,
Repart?
I just think that what you spelled out here shows the issues with having a separation edition for churches is so many churches rent, so that is problematic because that property owner is renting to that church and they may have a completely different opinion. So we certainly need to resolve that, as well as there's so many churches that are abandoned, haven't been functioning in a long time, and so how are we going to deal with that? So I think regardless of what we do, we need to have some real clarity around those two things. What actually constitutes a congregation?
Yep.
And then are we working with property owners or are we working with the pastor? Because I think that makes a big difference in terms of what opinion you get as to whether or not that use is accepted. So I think that those two things are really important to resolve.
In regards to the separation distance, do you have an opinion on that?
I think that if we're going to take it away from anything, it's churches because of that problematic trying to get who gets to give approval. Is it their consistory? Is it the pastor? Is it the owner? It's just a nebulous entity. But so I would say that I either say no change to the ordinance or I would be open to a discussion about changing the separation distance for churches.
Any thoughts about the possible solution to me, which seems like a compromise to maintain the waiver, would be to allow an opt-out language for those locations that don't want to be a part of a waiver and want folks from the industry to stop contacting them. That seems like a reasonable request. If the waiver stays intact, I do think we should give the churches that really want to be left alone and make it really clear that they're not interested for whatever grounds, whatever rationale. It seems like it would be fair to offer them an option to do that. It just seems like a fair option. As I look at these possible solutions, that seems like a fair one to me.
So is it not interested in having a dispensary near them or a facility, or is it not interested in having any input?
It's kind of like a
The
do
way
not
I'm
call
reading
list.
it is basically like a do not call list,
Yeah.
right? They're saying,
No input.
we're not going to issue a waiver.
Yeah.
We want to make that very clear, and we want to be added to this. Am I reading that option
Yeah,
right?
so
Like,
it would
keep
add
away-
to our administrative process.
Yeah.
What we would do is,
Yeah.
it would show on our maps that we have on the website, and we would maintain a list of churches that do not wish to be contacted.
Well, but again, the problem with that is, and I'm a church-going guy, pastors change, consistories change, churches change. My church has undergone an evolution about how we feel about all sorts of social issues. So it's real hard to pin down who's the decision maker of a congregation. Now, some places that's a pastor. It's not true for my church. So like, who's the person who's granting the waiver?
So
Well, we
don't we
must
have
have some,
examples
we
with
must have
alcohol?
examples, because we've gotten feedback from churches before on other
And alcohol.
decisions.
Yeah.
I got to believe that we have a process in place.
I'm curious.
Not a formal process in place.
So with alcohol, what do we do
We do not have a separation distance for alcohol.
with just the schools?
The state has the separation distance, and that's where Commissioner O'Connor was pulling for schools and churches. The state has that requirement, and they can grant the waiver.
So how do we
And the-
know if they're fulfilling that through the state? Because
The state has, the way the state works is you're barred from being within 500 feet. A notice gets sent to user within 500 feet. If the user chooses to respond, either proactively or negatively, they can. If they do nothing, then they're allowed, then it's approved.
Okay. So, yeah, then we can do the same thing.
Well, I'm curious I'm
Commissioner?
curious to know
That's how it should.
what
I'd be fine with that.
pastors or what denominations have you talked to? Because no one's called me or talked to me or bombarded me with calls about this particular issue. Or have I received any letters?
You may not be within 1,000 feet of a
Right.
potential site, though.
Well,
You're in the residential area.
I think they're looking at the sites, and then
right,
they're,
right. Well, I think that there are a number of individuals that want to put sites up around where our church may be in terms of its location. But I'm just curious, what pastors have you talked with? Because when you talk about churches, you're basically talking, as my colleague said, Commissioner Rappaport, is that you are talking either to the pastor, are you talking to trustee boards, are you talking to steward boards? I mean, who are they talking to? Because, for example, as a pastor, I don't make the head decision, but I have the last decision. But I think that there are times where we get church confused with an individual or with a congregation, because your congregation can be spread all out. And I think that's important to look at. So my concern is, who are you talking to in terms of the religious community?
Well, honestly, I can't name anyone.
I understand.
But I've certainly spoken with, I mean, as far as who the person is, in what their role is in the church, it's sort of been across the board. Sometimes it's a staff person, it's been a pastor, it's been a member of a trustee or a member of the board. I think I can, in general, say that I've received more calls from churches on the northeast side, in the Creston area, on the west side, and especially in the Leonard Street area. I haven't received too many calls from other places.
Yeah.
And for
See,
what it's
that's-
worth, they have kind of fallen off too.
So, but that what confuses me. You say you receive calls from churches. Are you receiving calls from the pastor of those churches? Are you receiving calls from the trustee, deacon boards of those churches? That's my concern.
And it's been across the board.
Yeah,
I don't
because
know
when
if
you
I
say
generalize.
churches, you're including everybody in that church. And I want to exclude that, because everybody in that church or a particular church may not be in favor of this. And I think that's important for us to think about. I'm in favor of leaving the 1,000 feet separation as it is.
Okay.
Commissioner Jones?
Can you go back to you said the schools and
Yeah, so for alcohol licensing in the state of Michigan, it's a 500-foot, they're not allowed within 500 feet of that use. However, there is an ability for you to get a waiver, and there's lots, I mean, my business and the brewery next door have a waiver. The Brew Vivant has a waiver from the school across the street. And there's lots of examples where alcohol uses are within, and what happens is a notice is sent when you make application to anyone who's within X number of feet. If they respond negatively, they're allowed to do so, but if they do not respond, then it's approved.
So silence is considered a waiver?
Because notice is given, and if you don't act on notice, then.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Commissioner Kelly?
I like that. I mean, following similar
I mean, if we're gonna compare it
expectations
to-
for churches and schools as the state has for alcohol. And I do think we need to define churches, though, because of this whole thing about the possibility of somebody opening a church in order to, one way or another. But I think that makes a lot of sense, just to go with 500 feet and do it the same as alcohol.
Yeah,
So
I
you're
think it's,
recommending changing from 1,000 feet to 500 feet?
And being consistent with alcohol use.
So that's a curveball.
That's not what was that's not in the language we passed, which granted, we can
Right.
open that back up for conversation.
But it makes sense to me to be somewhat consistent with that.
I-
What's the argument against that?
I would recommend for the purposes of this discussion and to keep us on track, that we don't go into modifying the numbers right now.
Okay.
I want to focus on the process and getting those things taken care of. We can always, as we have experience with this, look at modifying the numbers in the future. If recreational's passed, you'll probably go back and look at those separation distances again and have another conversation. But I think from the standpoint of just keeping things in a straight line,
Okay.
I would not recommend changing numbers.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, we've always said since the very beginning that we can always go back once we have some experience under our belt and make amendments. And so, we spent a lot of time on the distances and the ordinance language. We've spent hours on that. So today is really about giving clarification, identifying issues that have come up, and trying to provide clarity to the department so that they can move on what they need to do in order to get us prepared to take applications. So I think that the issue before us right now is waivers, because that has created, I think, an unintended consequence where churches are being contacted and there's questions around what is this waiver and waiver process. And the question at hand is, do we maintain the waiver as is and do nothing? Do we remove it? Sounds like there's mixed feelings about that. Or do we leave it as is and, to address the concerns raised, allow for opt-out language where churches can proactively say, at this moment in time, we are not interested in being contacted about a waiver. Now, maybe down the road, once we have some experience behind us, they'll decide to change their minds, but at least provide an avenue for churches to respond to what they see as problematic solicitation.
Well, I agree with that. I think that the opt-out is important. Do we have any experience with that, in terms of, then you get a new pastor or a new decision maker?
I think what we could probably do is treat it as an annual, just like we have with our Excella, and you send out an annual reminder or other permits, that we could send them a reminder and ask them to respond back if they want to continue to be in the opt-out as.
True, but if something's moved in the meantime, they can't close business.
I think they could always lift it whenever they wanted, but if they want to be on a do not call list for a while, then we could offer them that opportunity.
Yeah.
So we're talking about churches that are going to be 1,000 or 500 feet away from where a marijuana facility is going to be.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I wanted to be clear because I still have a problem with what churches have been contacted. I think that's my issue at this point in time.
Well, and I think it's just hard to know. It sounds like the planning department has been inundated by a lot of people asking questions about this potential ordinance and impact. I think that the issue at hand is we talked about having the distance and allowing for an opportunity for a waiver. And if we want to maintain that, which it sounds like some people do, then do we want to provide this opt-out language for churches so that they can proactively make that decision? And I trust the department, if that's what we decide to do, to come up with a seamless
Yeah,
system.
we can come up with something.
In my opinion. But Commissioner O'Connor, and then others, and then.
I was on deck too.
Yeah,
What list gets used for the alcohol notification? What, like, that's a, does the state have that, hold that list, or is that something that we populate?
We don't populate it, so I don't know where the state gets the list for churches.
Okay, well, I mean, to Commissioner Kelly's point, I mean, I would be, as much as I would like to remove churches from the required separation distance, I would totally be fine with the idea of if we can have because the definition of it, I think the definition of a church is, we need to have some sort of definition of that, so if the state.
And we do in the ordinance.
Right, so
and I can read that if you'd like me to read
But I
that.
think secondly, when it comes to, we need to, like, our diligence needs to be providing constructive notice to whatever qualifies as a church. And what happens internally at a church, whether it's a pastor making a decision or a board or a committee or whatever, that's outside of my control. That's an internal church decision that needs to happen.
Right.
And so I would be fine with the idea of, if an application is made, we provide notice to the 1,000-foot separation. If they have X number of days to respond, if they don't, then it's approved. And I would be fine with that as a compromise, because it provides everyone the ability to make that decision proactively, and it becomes an internal church decision on how they want to react to that, and we're providing an avenue for a waiver to be given if, in fact, a waiver could be given.
I concur with that.
Yep, and so to me, the process for a waiver,
We'll work through that.
you can work through that.
Yep.
So what I'm hearing around the table, and I can call the question, is that we want the original language with the waiver to be maintained.
Yep.
And then is there support with providing churches an opportunity to opt out if they so choose proactively?
Yes.
So item number 3. Go ahead,
So
Commissioner.
I just have a question, Suzanne. I'm trying to understand, so if the calls are coming in, are they explicitly stating that they have no interest in, because I wouldn't want the waiver to simply be to opt out. It may be opting in, maybe they don't mind. But if it's just one direction or the other, I don't know.
I don't think
If they don't mind, they'll let the.
We've gotten some
individual
calls
know.
with just questions about what is this about, but some of
Right.
them have been, I don't want them calling anymore. So there's been,
Them from contacting, so it really hasn't been, I have a decision already and I have no interest in this and I have no interest in providing a waiver.
there's
have
been
we
a
had that
combination.
too?
There's been some who've said we don't want to do a waiver.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And how much should I ask?
And how much money should I ask for?
Now, are there,
That's a business decision.
So that's it.
but I mean, is that typical that waivers are granted based on payment? I mean, that just seems.
We looked for other examples for waivers, and we couldn't find other examples for waivers between private parties.
I think that comes
For
down to
land use consideration.
again, a church making a decision based on whatever their ethical guidelines are.
That
I'm
could
just
be.
saying, it's.
All right, in the interest of time, because we have lots of ground to cover.
So it sounds like that's the mind of the commission with that. Yes. Provide for not.
Just
Commissioner Jones?
one, again, I would just ask that we, the more I think about it, the potential of considering reducing from 1,000 to 500 for the sole reason of then providing more opportunities to access properties in the city would be one. And again, having the peace of mind of keeping the 2,000-foot separation between the provisioning centers. So it's not as if it's going to, increase the number of provisioning centers, but it will increase the number of options that folks have for property.
You know, I'm happy to hear what others think. Personally, I feel like we spent a lot of time figuring out what properties would be available with the 1,000-foot separation distances. And I'm not comfortable making a change in those numbers until I see a whole set of new maps. And that, to me, opens back up the entire conversation that we had with the original ordinance. I am very happy down the road to revisit that and to make adjustments to the distances. But at this moment, opening back up that entire conversation, when we have all of these other issues to work through, I'm not sure we have time for it, one, and.
But I think that's a false equivalency, Mayor. I think in the idea that one of our options on here was to remove churches from the required separation distance, that's from 1,000 to 0. That's an option that's on the table to discuss. So the ability of Commissioner Jones to make a suggestion that we take it from 1,000 to 500 is something in the middle of what options have been provided to us for discussion. So I'm in support of Commissioner Jones's, especially as I make the argument, and so did 66% of Grand Rapidians in 2008, that medical marijuana is just that, is medicine. The idea that if we're going to compare it to alcohol, then the idea that parity in alcohol should be with marijuana should be on the table for discussion.
Yeah, and Commissioner, I feel like we've had this debate before. This is not about us supporting or opposing medical marijuana. I think all of us around this table have said that we do. This is about land use. And so I appreciate you continuing to bring that up, but all of us, many of us publicly supported medical marijuana when it was up before us as voters. This is a land use issue that there are real potential consequences to neighborhoods. And so we have to be mindful of that, and we know that from what's happened in other cities. And so I appreciate that perspective, but I want to stay focused on the issue before us, which is land use. So others who want to speak to that, I have two commissioners who want to look at reducing the distance to churches.
I'll just weigh in quickly, Mayor.
Go ahead,
I think that I agree with your point. I think if we're trying to move forward, we need to keep something steady. So if we've made some decisions, let's continue on. And then where there are gray areas like this, let's have those discussions so that we can make those a little bit more black and white so that we can continue to move forward. Otherwise, I think we will continue to kick this down the road, which is what you're in opposition of doing too, Commissioner O'Connor, because we're continuing to have the same discussions that we've decided on, and then it just delays things, I think.
Others?
I'm fine with going with the original distance, allowing the opt-out in the notice, but I do want to visit the comparison, and I think that we can wait a year and do it then.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Then I'm going to move on then with the second item, which is around public space.
Parks.
Parks.
Are you clear on
But-
those?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you clear on what we decided?
So I don't think you captured what I had said. So we're going to provide religious institutions the opportunity to proactively remove themselves. For all other instances, if someone makes application, we will then provide notice that a facility will be going into their neighborhood. They have X number of days to respond. If they do not respond, then it is approved.
Yeah, and that's a
Okay.
process issue that Suzanne said she'll
Okay.
work out.
Yes.
Very good. I just want to make sure that was all
Yes.
captured correctly.
But keeping in mind that the planning commission still has to determine whether or not there's
Right.
detriment. So there's
Okay.
still that other piece to it.
Okay.
The
And
second
you have somebody taking down all these notes? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So next item, waivers for public space. And
Waivers-
this is related to parks.
It is. Parks and playgrounds, we went to the Parks Advisory Board on September 5th, asking them how they want to address waivers to public parks. The advisory board voted not to review waiver requests for parks and playgrounds, but rather to defer to the city commission to do so. And so at our neighborhood workshop on September 28th, the neighborhood association representatives requested that the city commission hold a public hearing for parks waivers. What is significant about this is that it has timing implications for applications. So if we have an application deadline, we require that all the things are in order. And so it would require someone to come to the commission for a park waiver before they could submit for special land use, because we wouldn't know if the distance had been waived or not unless city commission has given consent. So the possible solutions to this problem: remove the waiver possibility for parks, remove parks from required separation distances, develop guidelines for granting a waiver and defer granting the parks waiver. You remand it back to the Parks and Rec Advisory Board or Planning Commission. You defer to another body. You have your own opt-out for parks that you don't want touched. Or again, the marijuana facility licensing types, or keep it the way it is, which means that if a parks waiver request is posed, it will come to the city commission and it will be up to you. And then the question would be from a process standpoint, if you'd want a public hearing.
And we could decide that as a body.
Yep.
I think that it bubbling up to us gives us the best chance to use that those waivers for what we want to accomplish. So I think that I'm in support of that.
Yeah. And I do think
I don't know
that-
about a public hearing. That's a new thought to me in the moment.
Yeah. It seems to me that we should give the neighborhood where the park is located an opportunity to weigh in.
So that would be with a public hearing.
That would be my preference. But commissioners, you want to weigh in on that? I think there could be very different feelings based on the neighborhood, the park, the size of the park, if it's next to a pool, or I think different neighbors will feel differently.
I'm still not sure why parks are on the list to begin with. I mean, again, we're using these as tool, like you keep talking about it being a land use discussion, and it is a land use discussion, but it's also, we've tried to layer in as many, and I think some of us have tried to layer in as many mechanisms as possible to keep the inability of people to do this. Like, and you've just layered in parks as another, like, what is this? I don't understand the sensitivity of the use around a park. If I have a medical marijuana card, I can get my medical marijuana and I can walk on the sidewalk at a park, and I just can't buy it within 1,000 feet of a park, but I can go there and use my medicine. Like, that just does not seem to be congruent. Like,
You can't use your medicine in a park.
if I eat it, I can.
Okay, we're getting off track. Commissioner, we know,
I'm just.
yes, okay.
This is why I
Others,
think that this gives, if it comes to us, it gives us the best chance to get what we want out of those opportunities.
others who wish to be heard?
This one is tough.
Well, I'd like to hear from Suzanne on this, because if it comes to us, that's going to interfere with the process of going to special land use. And
So what the recommendation then would be from a process standpoint is that you have an effective date for the ordinance, and then we would set a different date for the applications to be received, so that there is a window when, if someone wants a request for the park waiver, to be able to come to the city commission to ask for it before the submittal date for the special land use applications.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think we can
Then the
figure that
hearing
out.
is okay, yeah.
Time-wise,
So
I think
we
that
could do it, it's just, see, this is where that gets to that cascading, that's why I'm asking these questions now, because when we get to the application process, that's some of this timing thing that we want to make sure we're nailing down. Okay, so am I hearing that it stays with the city commission and the possibility of a public hearing? You guys will decide that when it goes to CD or comes to COW, and that we'll try to fit in the window then. It'll have that impact with the day the ordinance is approved versus the acceptance of the applications.
Yes.
so that's number
Okay.
6.
Is everyone good with that?
And then there'll be a list of parks that are impacted by this.
Yep.
So that, okay.
So you'll be
that
able to
people-
know which one's in the 3rd ward, which one's
Yeah, and then
in your ward.
And then would the residents be notified because it's a public hearing near those parks, like it would be for any other public hearing?
We could, that's just from an administrative standpoint, making sure that, understanding your expectations. So if you wanted it similar to what we do for a special land use request or something else,
Right.
then that would be a 350-foot radius notice. We could do that.
Yeah, and then it's kind of done all in one.
Good idea.
I like that.
All right.
No, we'll have to figure it out. No, Lana was asking a question of clarification of, you're thinking that you would batch all the requests at once?
That's what I thought I was hearing you say. That's what I thought I was hearing you say, that after you have the applications in, you could then determine which parks would be impacted?
The
And-
issue would be that, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine, go ahead.
The issue would be that the park waiver would determine the property's eligibility to even apply. So you'd have to get the waiver in hand before you could actually make application.
Yeah.
So do we have enough information now about which parks could potentially be impacted so that we can do this in advance of the application on all parks that potentially could be impacted?
The applicant would have to contact us to be set on the city commission agenda for you to hear the waiver before we accept special land use applications.
I mean, we do a
So
blanket.
it's not going to be that many parks. I mean, we've got
Okay.
our
Yeah.
zoning
we got
all
it.
figured
We're
out.
good.
I
Got it?
trust Suzanne can
We're
figure it
good.
out.
We got it.
I-
Yeah.
All right.
So it's number 6, basically, no change.
Next
City Commission.
one, this one's a fun one. So, yeah, so it's next 6, it's number 6 with no change. However, we will anticipate a public hearing and have the notification of those surrounding. Okay. Pre-qualification. I think some of the commissioners have had feedback on pre-qualification.
We have.
Uh,
I think
so-
probably all of us.
Yeah, so
We've all heard from a lot of people about this.
So this has, and I did pros and cons with this for a table because there are pros and cons to this. So state of Michigan currently has a 2-step process for prospective marijuana licensees. Phase 1 is pre-qualification, and then phase 2 is the licensing. So the phase 1 pre-qualification consists of an in-depth background check, personal history, financial disclosures, attestation to the required amount of capitalization for the proposed business, and more. So basically, it's the background check. It's saying we are looking at this individual as being capable of having a marijuana business. And then later, the licensing is actually looking at the facility and the location and the whole thing. But this is just attesting to the capability of that applicant to conduct this business, okay? So 42% of the applications that are received by LARA are denied in the pre-qual process. So that's a number for you. So the logic when we wrote the pre-qual requirement, so currently the ordinance requires pre-qualification before you can make application. We did this for a couple of reasons. One, to assist in avoiding speculative practices by any and all parties as part of the green rush. So anyone saying, oh, I have property, I think I'm potentially eligible, everybody thrown in for a special land use application. We wanted to make sure that if we're going to have medical marijuana facilities, we want them up and running, and that we want somebody who can actually implement this with the state of Michigan. 2, trying to manage city resources. If almost 42% of these applicants are being denied, we could be chasing our tails on that. And 3, really understanding the impacts this has on once that site is approved, then it basically creates a zone around it with that 2,000-foot radius. If it's for a dispensary, that no one else can apply until that license for that location or that approval we've given from a land use standpoint has expired or been considered abandoned. So if someone's going to get one of these approvals, we want to make sure they're implementing it because it has repercussions for everybody else around them in the process. So the pros and cons, a pro to lifting the pre-qualification requirement is that it does provide a greater opportunity for new applicants and recent entries into the industry. So if someone hasn't already been pre-qualified, this gives them a chance to enter and to seek application with the Planning Commission. Those who have already gotten their pre-qualification view that as a penalty, that I already did this, you already said you were going to just only take pre-quals, and now you're going to take anybody. Applicant readiness, in our discussions with LARA, they said that there are some good ones that have not gotten pre-qualified yet, that there's out-of-state firms that are interested. They hadn't expected Grand Rapids to move so fast, and they want to be in this market. They just haven't submitted their application yet. The downside, that according to LARA, was that some of the early ones that received pre-qualifications were from Lansing and Detroit, and those were the ones that had originally illegally established themselves. So you have a batch of people that might have been already pre-qualified, but
Illegal.
they may not be the ones that you want. Property speculation that you have, again, anybody can apply for approval. We do have millions of dollars. Literally, we have one applicant that has reportedly told us they've invested $20 million in properties for this. And so, kind of how much more would this heat up the market than it already is? I, of course, have to mention staff capacity and commission capacity, waivers for the parks, and also existing resources if you have a 42% fail rate of those pre-quals. So you're kind of balancing. If you remove the pre-qual, you provide some greater opportunity to people who haven't been through that process yet. The downside is that we'll likely get at least 100 more requests is what's anticipated for Planning Commission application, and then the burden as well as kind of the cascading effect on other interested parties who want to open a business but won't be able to as long as that approval is granted to that property until we consider it abandoned. So your choices are no change to the ordinance, keep the pre-qual, remove the pre-qual requirement, but require proof that the required paperwork has been received by LARA, including the application fee. So maybe they haven't gone through LARA's process, but we want to know at least they have completely applied and submitted their fee, so that at least they're serious. They're not doing it on speculation. You could incentivize pre-qualification, giving priority applicants who are pre-qualified, a higher status when we're doing the application process. Adopt a licensing ordinance separate from zoning, which would allow consideration of the merits of individual applicants or entities, almost doing your own pre-qual process before. I don't know if you'd want to do that. That's a whole nother administrative burden. Or just remove the pre-qual requirement, understanding that the additional effects that might create.
Okay. And Suzanne, can you walk us through these solutions? So for it seems to me that when we had this conversation, the intent was to ensure that the applications we received were for entities that were approved by the state and ready to go.
Yep.
And clearly there's pros to doing that. So in looking at these solutions, would number 2 get us closer to that ultimate goal to make sure that we're hearing from folks that clearly have the intent and the resources and the ability to open? Or would it remove some of the barriers that you also share? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out, from our perspective, I think our original consideration and the reason we added that was for a good reason. But I also am hearing the pitfalls and barriers that creates. So I'm just curious if you can weigh in on that.
Yeah, the number 2 is how we brainstorm. Maybe there's a way to straddle it a little bit. It still doesn't guarantee that they would be approved at the state, and so you still have that fail rate, but at least it would, at least express intent and maybe a little bit more serious that they're going to do something.
Okay. Commissioners, anyone feel strongly about this?
And there's if I'm wrong, correct me, but there's quite a backlog at the state right now for their own approval process, right?
There is. Landon talked to LARA last week, and they said that they expect by February, March, that backlog will be removed, that they'll be caught up.
Because they scheduled like extra meetings or something, I just read in the newspaper.
They've hired additional staff, and they're working through that. So we did call to verify both the fail rate as well as kind of where they are in the backlog, understanding that could be a barrier. In truth, by the time we go through the applications and do the zoning ordinance amendments, you're probably going to fall in line with the LARA timeline.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's not so bad, John.
Yeah.
Unless we can get rid of that moratorium.
So, so commissioners, any thoughts
on
this?
I'm on board for number 2.
Me too.
Okay, so number two, Commissioner Lanier Jones.
Yeah, I think number 2 probably is the best option, because I understand, because I think at our last meeting, someone gave public comment asking us to keep that provision. And we've had emails asking us to do the opposite, so that there could be, especially more local, and I think when we get further into the topics we'll talk about today, people who this really wasn't on their radar, at least not to the degree of already having applied through LARA. So this would then allow them to be considered and not ignored through the existing language. So I think I do like 2, because I think it's a hybrid of what we originally intended and what's come before us since then.
Yeah, I agree. Anyone feel differently, Commissioner Jones?
Just one quick question. Curious, Suzanne, if in the process of completing the paperwork for LARA, if the application is incomplete, is it spit back out to the applicant and they have a chance to correct it, or is it automatically just thrown out because it wasn't complete?
My understanding is that they work with the applicant to make sure they have all the necessary information.
Okay.
I don't know if you've...
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and the second question is it safe to assume that you could probably use some help with regards to some additional contractors in this work? Just a hypothetical question.
Yes, sir. I would say that would be a safe assumption.
Okay, thank you. All right.
Okay, so it sounds like there's direction there to go with number 2.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay.
Item D, provisioning center separation distances. Separation distances between provisioning centers that also have grow and/or processor components to them. So
these are the stacked,
yes.
that's what you called them earlier?
Yep.
Okay.
So,
So I
well,
want to make sure. I
co-located.
don't have my entire
Yeah.
file folder of medical marijuana.
You have stacked grower licenses, or you have co-location.
Okay.
Yes. So in this case, we have vertically integrated operations, co-located licenses, where you have a grower, processor, they'd also like to have a provisioning center. So we allow growers and processors in the industrial transportation zone district, and we allow provisioning centers as an ancillary use to that, so that you could have a fully integrated site. The issue that we have in this case is the 2,000-foot separation distance between provisioning centers, and we have a 1,000-foot separation distance between the grow and the processor. So we may have a situation in the industrial district where you have one user that they've met the grow and processor and they want a provisioning, but somebody else has a grow processor and provisioning, and they can't do the same.
How many opportunities? I guess I'm curious, how big of a potential issue is this?
Yeah.
I mean, if it affects maybe a handful of locations.
Landon, do you have a sense for in industrial districts how many sites we're talking about?
Yeah, how many sites? That's.
Most of the facilities that I've spoken with that want to have grows want to co-locate, have all 3 uses on the same site.
Okay. But how is, so they potentially would be impacted? Or is it that if a dispensary wanted to locate close to that facility, they would need to abide by the 2,000?
So provisioning centers or dispensaries can only be co-located in our industrial districts.
Right.
With a grower or processor. They can only be accessory. The issue is if you have 2 grow facilities that are 1,000 feet away.
Then both of them can't also have a dispensary.
Yeah.
Only one of them would be able to.
Establishes a provisioning center, which would then buffer the other one out.
Right, which I thought was the intent of having the distance requirement between them.
Right.
But I think that distance requirement, we were thinking for provisioning
For
centers
TBA?
really was for, commercial
Commercial
districts.
districts and not industrial districts.
And unless you happen to have, which I don't think you do, I don't know if you do have a commercial district right next to an industrial zone. It would really only be, like Landon just said, if there were multiple, 1 or 2 or 3 that were stacked, and they all wanted to have one.
So could we just make the exception for the industrial?
You can. In fact, that's item number 1 on your possible
Yes.
solution.
I didn't read your potential solutions yet.
Like I read your mind. Yes, that is exactly what could be proposed. So we could modify for the industrial transportation district, do an exception where you could allow a 1,000-foot separation for provisioning centers where that applied with co-location.
Commissioners, what do you think? I think that's a
Yeah,
fair
I'm good with that. I think that's fair.
compromise.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just changing distances. I mean, it's no big deal.
We already require 1,000-foot for the grow. I think it's because we are allowing stacked. Because
It's
we're
the
allowing
stacked licenses
co-location.
and, yeah.
Yeah,
It's just a logistical issue,
yeah,
so.
okay.
All right. Item E, safety compliance facilities and secure transporters. So this one's kind of interesting, similar to some of the comments you've heard. Some people like it, some people don't like it. So the safety compliance facilities and secure transporters, so this is people who are moving marijuana, usually like an armored vehicle, and then the safety compliance facility is basically a lab. So they're pretty benign uses generally, and so we've heard from several small business owners, generally local, that have approached staff asking about the prospect of operating a secure transport business, but have expressed concern because they're being priced out of the location opportunities due to the same separation distance requirements as other marijuana-related businesses. These two uses, the transport and compliance, have minimal community impacts in staff's opinion, and generally lower profit margins. They don't have the same access to capital to buy or lease that other ones do. So they're saying they're more likely to locate outside of the city because of this. But on the flip side, we've also had business owners who've said, how do I get a compliance facility or a transporter because I don't want a dispensary near me? And so they like, some property owners are looking to recruit transporters and the compliance facilities so that they don't have dispensaries within 1,000 feet of them.
They see that as, if I have this, then it protects me
Yes.
from.
So you kind of have both sides of it. So you could remove the special land use requirement, so at least it's a less of a hurdle. They may still be subject to separation distance requirements, but from an approval process, we handle it administratively in that one. Or you could, to remove the separation distance between those two types, but that doesn't take care of that other opinion. Or no change, just leave it as it is and see how it plays out.
Commissioners, thoughts on that?
I would consider leaving it as it is.
So we have a leave it as is, see how it plays out. We can always come back and change it at a later date, or others feel
I
strongly.
mean, I don't see the big deal in this one in the sense that it's, I mean, one is essentially a transportation opportunity. It's not a facility where there's medical marijuana in quantity. It's just someplace you keep trucks for the most part, because when they're
Correct.
when they're doing something, they're in use and they're not at the facility. And I'm assuming the requirements of the state do not allow you to keep product there. And the testing facility is a laboratory, which I don't see there's, I mean, that's going to be a secure facility where customers aren't coming. So they're in industrial, I mean, these are regulated to our industrial corridors, which are, there's typically not a lot of people around anyway, or parks, or, I think we could just get rid of the requirements on these ones altogether. I don't really see the big deal about these two categories.
Yeah, I think that they seem like benign uses, like Suzanne said, and so I don't have the same kind of concern for it.
So I was just told secure transporters are allowed to hold product for 48 hours.
48 hours, okay.
Mm-hmm. And compliance facilities are allowed in commercial districts as well.
Okay.
Mayor?
Yeah, go ahead, Commissioner.
So has there been questions or concerns?
You wanna talk
Why is this one before us today?
I've just had a handful of questions from largely practitioners, some property owners. This, I wouldn't say it was one of the major issues. Largely secure transport, people who want to get in industry and say this is a barrier. I'm getting priced out because of the competition, especially the provisioning centers, potential provisioning centers. So we're seeing a change in lease rates or purchase rates for the properties that are considered potentially suitable. Secure transport may not have the same kind of business model as a provisioning center, for example, and may not be able to be competitive on the same level. So largely from that perspective, the practitioners have been saying, I'm concerned, this has caused me to not be able to locate here.
So there are concerns about where they will store their vehicles. I'm just trying to fully understand so they can't find a location because they're being priced out for where they would potentially store the vehicles for their business.
Correct.
Because
be
under
within the
state
map.
law, they still have to be licensed.
The distance has to be there,
Yes.
right?
And so for like our surrounding communities that are not opting in, they're not allowing these facilities anywhere in their community. So like the other uses, you have to opt in to allow them, which then provides a small, tell me if I'm understanding this correctly. So because of how our language is written, they can only operate in the districts we identified.
Yep.
And one consequence that you talked about early on is as soon as we set these districts, the prices for properties in those districts are going to skyrocket, which we've seen in other communities as well.
They already have.
And so that's part of the problem.
Yep.
Well,
Well, and I think to the point, I mean, we talked about earlier, and you brought up someone's already invested $20 million, right? I think, again, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse about this moratorium thing, but I think for But no, I mean, listen, I mean, I'm a professional real estate appraiser and professional real estate broker, right? That's what I do. And so the idea that we're extending time for people to do this, like, I understand the motivation and why you wanted to provide more local people an opportunity to figure out how to get into the system. I think it will have and has had a converse effect in the sense that the people who have $150,000 to $500,000 of capital to get into this business typically are more sophisticated buyers, and they've already locked up all of the real estate you could imagine that is in our very limited pool with options, purchase agreements, lease agreements, options to lease, and it has artificially driven the car. I mean, I just looked, right, I got one up right here. There's a building on Alpine listed for sale for $850,000 that is advertised as meeting the medical marijuana facility, right? It's a 2,000 square foot building that probably has an SEV of $100,000.
But
Like,
Commissioner,
so
we knew that.
I understand. What I'm saying is that, like, providing more opportunities, if these are the lower point of entry business opportunities, it makes sense for us to provide more opportunities for the places that it's less capital intensive and has the least amount of potential community impact. That's the argument, to expand this to allow more of these types of the secure transporter and the compliance facilities in more locations.
All right, I'm following you now.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to go down a totally different path based on what you were saying.
But I was using the example of
That's a valid argument.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just want to add that
a lot of those.
Yeah, I would.
Let's not get carried away.
I would be in favor of option number two of removing the separation distances for those licensed types altogether.
My question, if we removed the separation distance, would it have an impact on the number of other facilities that would be allowed? Will this have any impact on the other locations? No.
No,
Okay.
what we would do is just make sure that this is excluded from, we'll write it in so that it doesn't impact anything else.
Okay, all right. Commissioner Kelly and then Lanier.
Well, I was going to say, I don't see why we need special land use approval either. I think this could be administratively done.
Do others agree with that?
Fine with that? Yeah, I think so.
Commissioner Lanier?
So I'm curious, Suzanne, about how this will impact the potential of increasing local ownership. And so that's ultimately the goal that I have, and I know that those who have the resources who are spending $20 million, they are putting measures in place that will reduce the level of local ownership. And so sometimes we may make a decision without asking the question.
Right.
And then there are unintended consequences that we don't think about or talk through. So I need to hear a little bit about how any change to this will impact that goal of trying to make sure we have more local ownership.
I think this does. I think Commissioners Kelly and Jones convened a group to talk about how you can build more local ownership in the community. And the sentiment in that group seemed to be, well, we may not be interested in opening up a provisioning center. We're more interested in the ancillary businesses surrounding the marijuana industry, and seeing that as a bigger opportunity for entry than trying to compete against some of the larger grow facilities or larger, like tobacco bills or whatever it is that they were recognizing they're new to the market, but they have strengths in either pharmaceuticals, which would relate to the testing, or in trucking, which would relate to the transport. So they were viewing it, at least that input that we've had, and as Landon attested, the local interest, that we think that the peripheral businesses associated with marijuana could definitely be more locally owned, and that we would have probably more strengths there because they're established.
So do we really think that we can have a conversation like this and people who have $20 million to start buying up stuff aren't interested in also having transport businesses and potentially could be putting measures in place to be able to tap into, because someone who's spending $20 million already
Right.
is thinking about how they can line their pockets. And so in any way, shape, or form, any of the licenses that are available, they will be opting into those. So how do we make sure that we can provide the opportunity? And maybe I'm in what letter is it? The equity piece. Maybe I'm further down from G, but I just think we need to really talk through some of that, because that's a bigger concern. And right now, I don't know how I feel about this one until we have the conversation about G.
Yeah. And that's okay. And one thing I will say is these have to be independently owned. You can't be like a beer distributor and own a brewery. So this is the same philosophy that they apply to this rulemaking. So these have to be separate business units that are owned separately from the other operations. So that may also make a distinction as far as profitability versus, you know, the kind of risk reward.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's any guarantees.
Right.
You know, it's really tough to even predict this.
Yeah.
But that does help, that those are separate and are maintained separately by the state law.
I haven't been a part of the conversations that Commissioner Jones and Kelly had, but everything that I've heard and read indicates that the real opportunities for local ownership will come if recreational marijuana passes, where there's opportunity for micro businesses. And I know that that's kind of a changing landscape as well. But
Yeah. And I think what I've said to that is it sounds a lot like redlining to me, that certain people can't get into the game until, if that passes in November, until that passes and they work through that. And I think it's an unfair advantage for people who have the means. And so I'm not interested in waiting until medical marijuana pass in order for local people to be able to get into this industry.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I think all of us feel that way. I think we're just struggling with what potential influence we have.
So
And maybe there are opportunities that have come out of conversations that some of you have had. I just am not
Just
privy to
2
that.
points, and maybe this does have to get discussed a little bit later, but in terms of capitalization requirements, because the secured transporters and safety compliance facilities cannot co-locate, it's a 200,000, which is about mid-range compared to the higher level growers or the provisioning centers. In addition, if we're talking about recreational, no licenses are going to be offered for any recreational unless you've already been in the game with MMFLA for certain types of facilities. So, FYI.
So what you're saying is that there is a lower barrier of entry for the transport and labs?
In terms of the capitalization requirements, yes, as compared to the higher level grow and the provisioning center.
Okay, that's good to know. Thanks. Okay, so it sounds like we have consensus around that, is to remove the separation distance only for these two licenses, and then move it to administrative approval.
Okay, very good.
All right.
And then I'm going to ask Kristen to also cover other ordinance amendments, just to provide just a really quick summary. I want to be respectful of the time. But you will see other small changes to the ordinance that'll be coming. I didn't provide them in the PowerPoint. They are listed here in your packet on page 8. But I'll ask her just to briefly cover those with you. These are a result of, again, more feedback. And it's one of those things that it's very hard to anticipate when you've written an ordinance until you live with it and you find out the kinks. So I'll let her talk about it.
Just so you weren't surprised, as we've been kind of cleaning up and addressing some of these larger issues, we found a few other things. So in order to sort of remove some things we found to be perhaps unnecessary or really barriers that we don't need, looking at regardless of what the prequal is, not requiring an applicant to submit everything to us that they give to Lara, because they give a full background, financials, and a lot of sensitive information that we really just don't need. So maybe make available upon request if it's needed, but not as part of your normal application. And then we thought security plan we don't really need to know what the life cycle of the marijuana is. We just need to know what your security plan is. Remove facade transparency requirements, sign requirement that's in there, and the license transfer requirement, because this is a land use. And then we clarified a few things in terms of the buffer language in the ordinance, which again, given the discussions we've had today, this will require a little more modification. But, there was a question very early on of when is a facility in terms of when these buffers trigger? Well, because we are talking land use, I've got a live mic here, that buffer will not trigger until the land use is granted. So they have to go all the way through the public, the planning commission, have it approved before that buffer exists. We are defining school in terms of what the school for the buffer applies, so there's no question there. And clarifying, because I thought there was a little bit of vagueness, that in terms of provisioning centers, that there's a 2,000-foot buffer between provisioning centers, but there's also a 1,000-foot buffer between a provisioning center and another type of facility. Just a little bit of a cleanup. We do anticipate, and again, this is going to be based on kind of in addition to discussions today, for owners of sensitive land uses, in terms of a waiver, it has to be the owner and the operator that gives us that grant, so that there's not an issue later of the renter and the landlord kind of coming to us saying, well, one did approved and one didn't. That all has to happen before it comes to the application. Clarifying that special land use, there is one special land use application per parcel. So in terms of an individual that wants to co-locate multiple types, so you have that instance of the grow, the processing and provisioning center, we'll take that as one application, but each use is considered separately. And we're not going to do dueling special land use. So it's one property, we're going to accept one application for that property, not multiple, because that's how we treat all other SLUs. And then just a couple minor cleanups. There was one marijuana that had a J and not a H, and little things like that. So. Okay.
Let me see if there's questions. I have a question related to the remove facade transparency requirement. What is it? That seems inconsistent with.
It'll still be in place. It's just in different places in the ordinance. So it'll be covered between the SEPTED ordinance and the zoning ordinance. It's just covered in other places.
I see. So it's not that we're removing that requirement. It's just okay. Thank you. Others?
That was my question. Is that the same for the license transfer requirement that's under that in the sign, the contact information requirement? All those are the same then, Suzanne? Same?
That would apply to all facilities, and we're removing that from all facilities.
Okay, and then my other question or point to make is in the first bullet regarding making the pre-qualifications for LARA available upon request. I think it's great that we're not requiring that, but subjective language always gives me pause. So I think we need to make sure that we're clear about when we would request that information so that we're consistently requesting it for the same reason, so we don't later have someone saying, well, my neighbor wasn't required and I was required, and I think this is why I was required.
That's
understood. Good point.
Yeah, that's a good point. Other questions about these kind of amendment, or I should say minor amendments or revisions? Okay, so commissioners, before we get to equitable development goals and VITA, do we want to take a 5-minute break?
Please. Yes.
Okay, so we will take a 5-minute break, grab some coffee or espresso, and I think that, there's a Dunkin' Donut card out there, but I think it leaves at 2.
Dunkin'.
Dunkin'. That's what I said.
Dunkin'? Not Dunkin' Donuts, Dunkin'.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. There's a coffee card out on Calder, but I think it might be gone. I think it leaves at 2. So
If you
we'll come back
in advance, write down ideas you have for the VITA. So we already have them up there. You can do that too during the break.
Oh, okay. I'm sure everyone.
Make you work.
Okay, be back in here at 2:57. 2:57.
Good try.
We are back at it, and hopefully there's some coffee over here on a cart. Help yourself, and we'll turn it back over to Suzanne to get us teed up. Do you need coffee? There's some right over here on a cart with some coffee cups. All right,
Okay.
onward we go. 3:05.
Yes.
All right.
Great. So one thing, you have little pads of paper and markers in front of you, and so as things come to you that you think you would like to talk about or you might like to see in a VITA, please write those down, because we're going to do a little exercise where we'll put them all up here, and we'll actually have the attorney sort them as to what they think meets criteria for a VITA versus general operating fund and tax revenue. So we'll have some of that discussion so we can kind of sort and discuss. But just for some background, we're talking about a creation of a voluntary equitable development agreement, a VITA, for marijuana uses. This would follow similarly to the VITA developed around the Housing Now recommendations, and that VITA was developed to provide for three-party agreements between the city and investor and a community-based organization that would allow for the community, the city, and investors to voluntarily commit to various goals and joint interests. So it's similar to a community benefits agreement. I won't read through the uses. It's on the board, and it's also in your handout on page 9 about the VITA, the original VITA policy that we have. We envision a separate VITA policy or some other thing, some sort of separate policy for marijuana uses. And why is this important related to marijuana? So historically, communities of color have been disparately impacted by enforcement practices related to marijuana. Several communities across the country have attempted to use their own marijuana administration programs to remedy such impacts. Policies to ensure racial, ethnic, and gender diversity in the cannabis industry can be implemented through city commission policy. So this is a policy, not an ordinance. While there are potentially significant barriers to entry to the industry for all people at the state level, local policy could lessen such barriers through incentivizing equitable development. And so we really wanted to focus on what could we do and how could that be done. In that discussion, there are some bumpers that we have because of state law that would allow us to do this, but we really want to today understand the Commission's goals, what you would like to see achieved, what are your priorities, and understanding that in some cases, some components of a VITA may be better suited to certain marijuana businesses, maybe not all. So, if you set a goal for energy consumption, for a grow facility versus a transporter, you're going to have some differences. So in our discussions, what we think would be most beneficial, and Jessica will be taking you through this discussion, but the idea of a standardized VITA, that you have certain criteria that you would like to see in a VITA, and that it could be a menu of sorts where an applicant could choose things. Again, this is voluntary, so they're offering this to the city to do, and that VITA has some of those options in it and some flexibility to it as well, but that expectations are clear and defined for the applicant or the industry interest. We think that would be beneficial because we didn't want to get into a unique agreement for every business. Or between a business and a neighborhood, or how would we do that for each one, given that you're going to have multiple requests and multiple discussions across the board. So some uniformity allows for, in some cases, maybe less discretion, but also I think protects us a little bit more, and that we're very consistent and clear in what we want. So I'll turn it over to Jessica to talk about, provided some guidance. You'll see some of that on page 10 of your handout.
Hi. Okay, so Suzanne pretty much said it all, but we're focusing, and this is going to take some time, on this concept of creating a VITA in the context of this process. And we need a new name for it, first and foremost, and we like WITA but we don't know. We can't, you guys were open to suggestions. Because it's really not the same thing as a VITA, so we do need to refer to it in some other way. We need, it's hard to beat that.
Marijuana?
We need guidance from you as to both the form that this should take and the substance. So that's what we're looking from, and as Suzanne mentioned, there are legal parameters. And I'm going to keep going back to that again and again. But we have some ideas for how you might be able to accomplish some things after these funds reach your general fund, which is a longer-term solution, perhaps. So that being said, please keep in mind that, again, as Suzanne mentioned, this is just a voluntary part of this application process. It is not required the way that we envision it, nor can it be. It is a voluntary part of the application process, and all that it would impact is the order in which the applications would be processed. So it is simply a matter of affecting or improving your place in line, essentially. And we can talk more about that in a minute, but in other words, if you meet some of these requirements or are willing to add certain requirements to the approval process as an applicant, you can get essentially points, I hesitate to call them that, and get moved up in the prioritization process. So that is the idea here. It has nothing to do with actual approval. You still have to go through the regular land use approval process. So that being said, I don't know if you have in front of you just the legal rules guiding discussion on medical marijuana application prioritization procedure policy. Do you have page 10? Oh, okay, sorry, I got factored into page 10.
Really?
Okay.
I didn't like the table, so I put it
Okay.
into that form.
Oh, fine.
It's
fine.
also here.
It's the same thing. Okay. So I don't know if you want to go through the bad news first or the good news. What you can do and what you can't do.
Let's do the bad news first.
Okay. What you can't do as a prerequisite to this, you can't extract anything illegal. In other words, the conditions that you impose, and again, it's voluntary for folks to sign up for this, but once they do, we anticipate this becoming a binding part of a contract with us, right? So once they agree to do it, then they've signed on and it's going to be enforceable. That being said, the conditions have to be reasonably related to the permit or the land use. You cannot do things that don't have a nexus, and that's because of the whole Dolan-Nolan case law series, which I'm sure you've heard of before, having to do with land use specifically. So, in other words, to sort of phrase it in the opposite way, you can impose conditions that are reasonably related to the need created by the use, and there must be a rough proportionality between the impact of the development and the nature and extent of the conditions imposed. So there has to be a relationship between what you're asking them to do and the land use being sought, if that makes sense. So, okay. So that being said, what we've seen in examples in other communities that we really like are things that clearly relate to land use. And those are things like infrastructure, energy efficiencies, which could really be relevant in terms of grow facilities, and possibly businesses located in underserved areas as defined by CDBG boundaries, for example. So we've tried to come up with some things that you can consider or make conditions of this agreement versus things that you can't do. And those are things like you can't do things based on racial quotas or percentages because of Prop 2 and the Equal Protection Clause. You can't do things that conflict with existing medical marijuana regulations and the law. And you can't do things that conflict with the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act. We have a couple other barriers in this state, which I know you're familiar with, and we analyzed a lot when we were creating the first VITA, and those are things like the rent restriction legislation. A local government can't do anything, can't enact, maintain, or enforce an ordinance or resolution that would have the effect of controlling the amount of rent charged for leasing private residential property. So those are some of the barriers or the parameters to keep in mind as you think of things that you would like to request of these applicants. Now, there's a couple different forms this could take. one idea would be to have it be like a pick list where an applicant goes online and literally checks from a menu of items that they think they'd be willing to commit to. And that becomes a binding part of their contract should they pass the approval process. So in other words, just sort of incorporate it into the application checklist process. The other thing would be to enter into separate agreements with them, like the VITA in the traditional context. One thing we feel pretty strongly about is that whatever you come up with, this checklist, this menu, it needs to be standardized because as Suzanne mentioned, you cannot be negotiating individual deals with individual applicants. So what we'd like to do is narrow this down to those things that are important to you that we feel that you can require legally, and if you could give us some guidance in that respect, then we can create a form and that will help us to create the procedure for processing all these applications.
And then do you want to talk about the other, and then the other side of it?
Oh, sure, this is the exciting side. Okay, so to the extent that you're disappointed because there aren't certain things that you should really require in this context, bear in mind that if you're willing to have some patience, the revenues that will be generated, once they're in the general operating fund, then you have policy decisions to make about how they're spent. You have a lot more flexibility after the money comes in. So I know that's sort of a sweeping statement, but in other words, if you decided you wanted to create mentoring programs for people who wanted to get into the business, or even put something in your affordable housing fund, those are things that could come into play after the money was received, but not as a prerequisite to this land use approval. Any questions?
I have one, yeah.
Okay.
Can you please define for me the MLBE contracting guidelines?
The
So that
MMLB?
The MLBE? Our micro local business enterprise? Yeah.
I don't know.
Contracting, because it's in here as one of the items, it's bullet number 4, but what does that mean?
Okay.
Explicitly?
Okay, if you want me to just read the actual definition, a couple of things. The previous 3-year average business revenue or permanent number of employees is 25% or less of the Small Business Administration's NAICS Industry Small Business Standards. The controlling owners totaling 51% or more individual personal net worth as determined by SBA is $250,000 or less at the time of initial application. And then for continued microbusiness eligibility after admission to the program, net worth shall not exceed $750,000. So it's primarily based on net worth and income.
The size. I thought there were also, within the MLBE, there were geographical boundaries in which one could classify as a micro-local business enterprise. And I thought that was county-wide.
Okay.
Eric is coming.
We've recommended some geographic considerations in relation to CDBG, but just so you know, the map that you have in your packet is CDBG boundaries, but.
Hi, Jessica, can I
Absolutely,
step in?
come on in.
Thanks. If we need some real expertise, we could get AJ Hill in, but I'll do my best. So for the MLBE definition, what Jessica told you was what type of businesses qualify. And so those businesses to be eligible for our construction program need to be located within Kent County.
Kent County, okay.
Okay. And then but within the MLBE policy, there are a number of criteria under which persons or companies can be eligible for a bid discount. And so it's all having to do with the bid discount. So those could be employing persons from the general target area, though is one of them. Being located within the GTA or in the city. They're doing environmental education or environmental projects is one. tutoring at school, school kids within GRPS is another. So there are a variety of assorted discounts that people can earn as part of the process of achieving a bid discount.
So if we were to have this in the WIDA,
Pretty snappy, huh?
One more time.
and then it's done, it's in there. So we had that in there, would we follow those same guidelines, because this bullet is stating MLBE contracting? So, I mean, are we looking to just kind of duplicate what we already have in the MLBE? And if that is the case, it really would be good to, because I think in theory, I know what that means, but if I'm looking at mirroring the language, I'd like to see all of that language to be able to know, and don't get me wrong, I was the one suggesting that the MLBE policy was one that we would look at as we were having this discussion, but I want to make sure what's in there fits.
We could refer to it by reference, or we could include it in the policy, either way. And what we would,
There are financial, yeah.
what,
MBE.
but, let me finish before you contradict me, okay?
I will.
So, I'm going to go back and
Okay.
rest in a minute. So, so what we could do is include those parts of the policy that are relevant, and it could be the person who is filling out the VITA for marijuana use might say, I intend to use contractors that are pre-qualified by the city to do X in a certain amount, or I intend to follow employment practices of X as provided in this policy.
And I know also when we're looking at contractors, if they have a percentage of their business that is tied to an MLBE, then that, like you were saying, or maybe Jessica was saying, then that provides points. And I'm not sure how that pointing system works, if you just get 1 point flat, or if there's a grade of multiple different points too.
Talk about that.
Yeah.
And it may be good timing, Commissioner, because as you know, this came up about a month ago, and we said we wanted to revisit this policy around MLBE, WMBE. So this may be good timing to revisit that in general, because one concern we had is that you could have a $13 million project and 100,000 of it goes to a minority-owned business, and you get the same percentage discount.
Right.
So it's probably good timing to review that.
Something, though, that a big caveat to that is that the MMFLA has certain financial ability requirements built in, and we can't override those. So to the extent that there are inconsistencies, that's something that we need to take into account.
So are you saying they may override the numbers that you just read off when you
Might
read
be
off
higher,
the?
correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Well, but those requirements are for who has a license, not necessarily who does the work. So, so there can be you can sort it two different ways. Is what I would say.
But I think some of the other piece to the MLBE really is and I think some of our issues here economically in Grand Rapids is tied to ownership. And so I like the idea of job creation, and I think that that's important. But I think what's more important right now is ownership in communities of color more specifically. And so, how do we figure out a way to make sure that we have provisions? And I'm starting my list, Suzanne, with my sticky note.
Yeah. Well, to the extent that there are different requirements, we could amend the requirements for MLBE, because we already have a VITA policy, but we're doing a separate VITA policy for marijuana. So we could also have separate MLBE requirements for marijuana as it pertains to ownership that correspond to these requirements. So there's a way to do it, I think.
Thank you.
And I think it's a good idea, too.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Suzanne, you getting that down?
Yep.
Okay.
So you do have, on page 9 is what you currently have in the existing VITA. That doesn't mean that, some of these, there may not be a nexus between that and marijuana use, but it's a start. It gives you some ideas of things that you've discussed in the past and included in policy. And I think we could start there if you wanted to talk through. I guess I'll give you two options, whether or not you want to write down all of your ideas and discuss this, or if you want to talk about the application process and come back to this, which would be your preference? Because we could do it either way.
I think we should stay on this and talk about it. And maybe we can even find consensus just by talking, and we can use sticky notes too if y'all want to, but I'm with Commissioner Lanier. My priorities are economic, economic opportunities and wealth generation, and investing in the neighborhoods of focus. You know, I see this list, and, you know, vital streets wouldn't be my top priority. I mean, maybe we can come to some consensus in looking at this list, but even expanding beyond that. Commissioner.
So I do have a question, and I'm trying to find it. Jessica, you mentioned something about the CDBG locations.
Right.
Which page was that?
It's actually right in the very back of your handout.
Oh, okay. But it was written in text too, because I remember seeing it and I hadn't gotten to the back.
That was in the application process.
Okay, so I'm wondering, are we only talking about where the structures would exist? Or are we talking about where the owners come from?
Well, and that's something you need to decide.
Okay.
That's something you need to decide. How we've seen it elsewhere is, you know, typically the focus on where the business is going to exist. That's the thing that makes the most sense, I guess. So
I'm sorry, Jessica, I can't hear you.
So,
Hey, commissioners.
typically, the emphasis has been on where the business itself is going to be located. But we could see it going a number of different ways. So,
Explain that.
Okay.
Explain give me an example of that.
well, in other examples that we've seen, and in terms of like creating that nexus between what you're asking them to do and the outcome that you seek and the use being sought, in terms of generating economic opportunity, it seems like that makes more sense than to have just like somebody's residence being there. That doesn't really tie with the land use,
Right.
if that makes sense. Whereas generating business within that particular district is more defensible legally, frankly.
What if it's a combination? So what if the person resides
Yep.
and the structure are in the neighborhoods of focus? So then.
Like a local preference.
Exactly. So then you're saying that the owners are from the neighborhood where the businesses are being established, because I think if you do it in the reverse and it's only about the structure, then you get what potentially could be saturation in
We don't want
in
that.
the areas of focus, and we're not looking for that. And then they could be owned by people who live who knows where.
Right.
So there's no tie into the person who's owning what's in that neighborhood, which is what we're really trying to get after.
Can we do a local preference?
Yeah, we can work something along those lines in.
Commissioner
Local
O'Connor, and then.
Remember, this just has to do with the order in which their applications are processed.
Right.
So if we want to have a local preference where individuals from Grand Rapids are considered priority first, right? Because that's what we're talking about.
And
Potentially.
again, that would be considered in the context of the entire pick list.
Right.
Okay.
So that, and then we cover that in the application process, not
The VEDA
necessarily in the
Criteria, right.
Okay. All right, I'm sorry. So thank you for clarifying that. Commissioner O'Connor, and then did I see a hand over here, commissioners? Okay.
So, I mean, you guys know where I was at on this. I didn't vote for VEDA because I didn't think it was fair to single out a specific industry to make this apply. Now, the tenets of a VEDA and some of the potential outcomes that we're trying to accomplish, I certainly do agree with. And I think, to my Commissioner Lanier's point and the mayor's point about economic opportunity, I think that's what we want to create, economic opportunity for people who live in Grand Rapids to do better. And I think we should think about this differently. Instead of saying, like, using land use as the mechanism to try to create different outcomes, we should be thinking about this in a similar capacity to our corridor improvement districts, or our DDA, or our even our tax incentives, like we did with the affordable housing plan, right? I just gave you an example of a building on Alpine Avenue that's probably got I haven't looked up the SEV, but an SEV of $100,000 that once it sells for $865,000 is going to uncap and create a whole lot of new property tax revenue that is going to be generated by the city. And if someone comes in and invests in that property, it's going to make that SEV go up even further. There's going to be tax capture. And so rather than use the VITA or use land use as the mechanism, why don't we use the increase in the uncapping of a property that's going to generate more revenue from the city to bring in more, essentially, more dollars that will go into general fund that we can then use flexibly to do all kinds of things to incentivize economic development with. Instead of trying to backdoor it through land use protocols, do something where we have way more flexibility in the way we can and invest in the things that we want to invest in.
You know, I hear what you're saying. I personally don't think it's one or the other. I mean, that inevitably is going to happen. Mm-hmm. And I mean, not that a significant portion of our revenue stream is property tax, but when you look at our overall budget and our revenues, but we're already going to have that opportunity. You know, when we talked about VITA, we talked about it as a community benefit agreement, which is really what it was based upon. And, you know, just like developers going into a neighborhood, there's benefit. How are they going to benefit the community in order to have certain incentives from the city? And I think that was the framework that we talked about when we talked about having a VITA be a part of this, this ordinance. So commissioners, I mean, do you feel differently?
No, I agree. I think we're going to get both. But if we really want to have, especially I'm thinking local job opportunity, then we have to use this tool as well. We have to try to guarantee it to the extent that we can.
Yeah.
But I think that...
Go ahead, Commissioner.
That's where I think that we keep the list short and we focus on the very, very specific things that we want to accomplish. You know, I have 4 things: local ownership, local hiring, living wage, MLB contracting. Mm-hmm. Those are the 4 on my list. The rest of them, you know, if we don't get anything green infrastructure, I'm fine with that. These are the 4 things that and then I've got my list of things for general operating down the road, but let's make the list short, the things that we really want to stimulate.
What were your 4, Commissioner, if you could repeat those, please?
Local ownership, hiring local, paying a living wage, and using MLB contracting when you're constructing your facility. So I don't know whether or not we give points or whether or not we give them that menu. I don't know how we do that. That's something that we need to talk about. But.
Yeah. Well, so mine are around the same economic opportunities and local preference, and even maybe thinking creatively about support for entrepreneurs and startups.
That's on my general operating list.
Yeah. You know, and the thing about the general operating, I want to be careful that we don't get ahead of ourselves. One, we're not really sure how much, one. Secondly, we don't have a good sense of enforcement or other city services that are going to be needed. I mean, we've already heard from our police department and our chief saying this will likely require more officers. And so I want to be careful about that, and I just don't want to have those conversations prematurely. My hope is that there's funds to be able to do some of the things that we want to do, but I also want to be mindful that we may have other expenses that we're not anticipating at this time. Just like the planning department getting inundated by 200 calls a week, and as Commissioner Jones already suggested, them needing more staff. I mean, that costs money, and that comes out of the general fund. So,
I've got a couple things, Mayor. One is, I see I think one of the opportunities here is to look at this issue through an equity lens, because authentic equity would turn this, in many ways, would make this it would give the appearance of this being very uneven, because in an effort to make things more equitable, it literally means that there's the reality that those who have or who are at a certain level, it's an opportunity for those who aren't at that same level to catch up. And so if we're looking at it through that lens, then I think that's and if we say that we're committed to equity, then that's part of what we have to live with in terms of any pushback or any discussion or debate about why we would move forward with something like a VITA. I also would see this as perhaps the impetus behind the potential of enacting VITAs for other industries as well. again, if we're looking at it through a lens of, if we're looking at it through an equity lens, we're talking about things that are very uncomfortable. We're talking about things that probably wouldn't be popular. But if the goal is to get to a place where we're more equitable, it's going to take tapping into areas and systems that historically haven't had a whole lot of pushback. It's kind of been business as usual. Mm-hmm. And so I put that out there because, and I've heard my colleague Commissioner O'Connor say it before, that this should not be. In some ways, it's like we're just picking on this industry, and I'd be in favor of, I wouldn't say picking on, but I would be in favor of giving other industries an opportunity to show their commitment to equity as well. This is part of what it's going to take to get us in a different place as it pertains to us being a city that can say that we're committed to equity. And so, you know, the idea of local hire, the idea of, again, focusing on neighborhoods of focus and specific zip codes, all of those things I think are very beneficial, because I've read countless articles of what's happening in California and Oregon and all out west, and you know, there is this, that, you know, no other city or state has gotten it right.
Right.
And I don't know if we, who's to say that we're going to get it right. But, you know, I would like to take a good hard look at what is working in the likes of California, Oregon, and Colorado, and look to see if we can emulate some of that. Because whatever, if we can see movement, if we can see the needle move, in which folks who have been historically marginalized are feeling as if they're benefiting, at least, you know, to some extent, in those states, and that would be a good thing to follow up on. So.
Yeah, well said, Commissioner.
So I have another question, and this may be for you, Suzanne. So, or maybe you, Jessica. I'm not sure who said this, or maybe Eric. No, I'm just kidding. Somebody said something about this would determine the place in line for application review. Can you expound on that? Just expound on that. I can ask some specific questions, but I just kind of want to hear what you're thinking with that.
And that's actually, if you go to page 12, the very next topic, and these two are very closely related, the application process.
Okay.
This has to do with the guidance that we're seeking with regard to how you want this to all go down in terms of process and prioritization, because there are a number of different ways to do this. So I don't know if it's time to move on then to that, or maybe we could talk about them together.
Well, do you want to collect our little sticky notes? It sounds like there was quite a bit of.
I think this helps, so define. I mean, I've got some here, but
I just want to make a quick mention about the
I gotta write mine down.
the living wage issue. I know that this issue's come up before, and unfortunately, there's a statute that really ties our hands in that regard. So I'm happy to, or we're happy to talk to anybody about that. But
if it's voluntary, still.
There's actually a statute that even prohibits that, which I know is counterintuitive, but I'm happy to show it to you.
Okay.
It was a state preemption bill that was passed, what, in June of 2016, I believe?
Yep.
That is, it prevents us from banning the box, it prevents us from mandating certain wages or requiring them.
And the odd thing about the statute is that it first carves out this huge exception for voluntary agreements in the form of economic development agreements, but then it says subject to, and it lists 3 sections, and one of those is wages.
Right. I know.
So I have a question, Jessica. Say we want to focus on neighborhoods of focus. I mean, given this morning's conversation, it seems important. Can we do anything around both those who are hired who come from a neighborhood of focus, so that it's a job opportunity, and or I mean, we don't want to saturate, but some sort of preference in terms of the applications that they come out of neighborhoods of focus.
Yes, we think we could work something like that in. Yep.
Okay. Well, it seems to me that those are two valid consideration.
So what we're hearing is local preferences all around, hiring, ownership, residency.
And I even think that, oh, I'm sorry, Mayor. Mayor, may I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I even think that, that because the locations are limited, I think that if you live in the city and have ownership in the city, they don't necessarily need to be in the same neighborhood, but I think the fact that you are from here says that you're invested here. So I just think that that's another, and that may mean one member of this, and I don't know what the percentage is, but a member of the ownership team meets that requirement.
Right.
And I don't know what the percentage would need to be so that we don't have some reoccurring things that we're seeing in construction, but we need to figure out what makes sense for that too.
And actually, we've already heard of some instances of that where people will associate with the local resident in order to meet the requirement and then.
And that's it.
Right.
Right.
So, but we would need to know what from here meant too. So we would need more guidance from you on that. Does that mean they have an established business within the city boundaries for the last 5 years? Does that mean, you know what I mean? So we need more
Sure.
detail.
I just think a resident. I don't think because this is a new industry, and I think, you know, the same reason we were talking about slowing down so that people who are newly interested in this may get into this game. I think that they may or may not already be business owners. And so I think saying having an existing business may be too restrictive, but I think an established resident says that they're from Grand Rapids.
And would we need to put a time limit on that?
Yeah, and I
Right,
think
like-
we probably should. And I think the critical piece really is the percentage of ownership. And then how long is that ownership to go back to monitoring whatever we come up with so that there isn't this buy off, you know, get someone involved and then buy them off. No, if you're going to buy them off, you're going to buy them off at a high level with the earnings that you're getting from such a lucrative industry.
Well, and just to prepare you, I also want to have that conversation about how do we prevent individuals from being
even
bought
doing
off.
it, right.
All of us have read the articles about investigations at the state level with state employees accepting bribes. I think whether we have time to have that conversation today or at a later date, we take a lot of pride in our city to have integrity and to prevent corruption and bribes, and I want to make sure that this process is foolproof when it comes to that. And I don't know what that looks like, but I think we need to have that conversation as well.
So then, Mayor, would we come back, because I think you all are hearing a lot, and so then would we come back, even if it's just a couple of these, and come back and talk a little bit further about how that would be, what we can do and what some options would be?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, knowing your priorities is really, really helpful because then that helps us craft something that we'll come back with you to react to. So that's really what we wanted is some of this feedback. The application process was mentioned, and so I'll jump into that because that was, that's really, I think, the key to this. So one of the challenges that we have, the issue in this case, is that we've had so much interest, as we've already talked about, which we believe will lead to a significant, unprecedented number of applications that will be submitted for Planning Commission review. So we currently don't have an administrative process in place to take that many applications all at once. We usually do first come, first serve. We went through a process of discussing this. What happens if we do first come, first serve? What would that look like? Based on the experiences of Ann Arbor, they had people lined up outside their door for nearly a week. Even in the village of Douglas, they had people camped out for 4 days. And those are much smaller markets than Grand Rapids. And so staff, I was on my honeymoon, but staff met with the police department and treasurer, and there was a lot of different discussions. There were several concerns that were raised. One is that marijuana industry is basically a cash-only business because of banking, although some are figuring out banking. But there's still cash that can be involved. The police department was worried about people camping out if they had cash on them and money and what that might mean. There was also concerns from a building safety and security standpoint. If we took applications, for example, down at 1120 Monroe, it's a multi-tenant building. It's not just city offices. If we did it here at City Hall, had people camping out on Calder Plaza, it might conflict with other things that are going on. And again, it could be a safety and security issue, as well as restrooms. How do you meet the needs of, people and their comfort? The city treasurer's office went through and had some discussions with staff about how they might take in a large amount of cash if they were accepting applications and the application fee was being paid at the same time. And they were working through, well, would that system look like if they're trying to anticipate, which would mean that we would probably have to have services rendered here at City Hall, and what level of security would we need to be able to do that?
Could we do it at the police department?
So there was lots of logistical issues, and the police department was safety and security of the patrons or the applicants and them coming to the site. So we started to research then other methods other than first come, first serve to see if there was a way to do it. We also had a lot of discussions about point systems, because the more discretion, to Commissioner Lanier's point, the more discretion that there is for staff to use, there's more opportunity both for litigation, which is happening in some communities, because I don't want to get into a debate about a quarter of a point on somebody's scoring, or any association with bias or anything else. So we don't really want to get into doing a points-based system where we identify priority, but we did want some sort of sifting process. But we also found in the research that the most defensible way is more kind of I know the word lottery had been used, and it was used incorrectly, but the idea of some sort of random draw, that there's some sort of process, but that doesn't mean you can't have multiple draws. Mm-hmm. So is there a filter that we look through and think about a random draw, but it's after they've met certain criteria? So for example, if you're doing an application, and I don't know if I have it on here, if you're doing an application and you say, we really want to make sure that we want to encourage people to think about doing a VITA. Again, we're not requiring it, but if we're trying to pick what the application process will be, because we would have a window then where we would take applications in rather than having people line up for a week or longer outside our door with all the security issues and all the other unusual things that we would never have to think about ordinarily for other development projects, that if the application would be complete, so that's a simple staff review of have you met all the criteria that are contained in the application, the city commission by policy would say, we're interested in people who want to work with us, and if they're willing to do the voluntary equitable development agreement or some other name for it, that maybe satisfies a certain number of outcomes that you want to see, or maybe it's prescribed. The other option could be general target area or neighborhoods of focus, that if it's in this area, then you can be in the first draw. Other options could be if there's no waivers that are needed, so that you're picking the cleanest application where you have the most likelihood of success if you have no waivers. And then whether or not you want to have, if they've been pre-qualified. So those were just ideas. That doesn't mean to say that we're saying this should be it. Then the second draw, it could be maybe you've met a couple of these things. And then the third draw would be you've submitted your application. So we could prioritize what kind of random draw we wanted to have. We're not basing it on a point system. We're not evaluating, say they submit the VITA and they say we're going to achieve these things. We're not reading through and giving them points based on what they said. It's just you've met this criteria. Yes, you're in that draw. So that's the process that we've discussed at length to try to figure out how do we kind of both achieve the goals that you want to achieve, take into account public health, safety, and welfare, and then manage the amount of interest and workload that we would have.
Suzanne, I have a question. For Ann Arbor, my understanding is they passed a moratorium after they had a number of issues come up. Has that been lifted yet, and do they have a process in place now?
I don't know if they do.
I believe they just set a cap.
Okay. Hard cap.
I know there's probably, they have a cap? Okay. 28,
Okay.
and that's what they have.
Okay.
They basically froze the process
So
after they took them in.
capped it at the amount that
Yeah.
they currently have, so they're not taking any more applications. Okay. All right, so commissioners, thoughts on this? So on page 13, you have a couple possible solutions for first draw, second draw, third draw, or even how to prioritize applications. Initial thoughts? I personally, especially if the VITA is largely revolves around economic opportunity, and includes some of what we just talked about, then I'm supportive of that. Moving up someone to a tier 1 draw. Other thoughts, John?
And I sort of briefly
Commissioner, I'm
mentioned this to my colleagues, as much as I'm frustrated by singling out this industry. If we're going to do a VITA, I think it's just important for outcome's sake to focus on those one or two things. We can't solve all the problems at one time with one industry and pick a couple of things that are really important and let's focus on those. Let's focus on a couple of very specific outcomes that are very important to this body and this community, and not put a laundry list of trying to solve every little minor issue or challenge or concern. Just be targeted about this.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. So in looking at this list, to me, the bullets under the first tier draw make a lot of sense. That, we're considering folks that have a complete application, a submission of a VITA, general target area, no waivers. As you said, Suzanne, I think that would create kind of a cleaner application. And then, so, thoughts?
What does the no waiver really mean?
Meaning that they're in a location that doesn't require a waiver.
Oh, I
right?
see.
That they,
Okay,
that
okay.
out of the ordinance that exists,
There's nothing in
what,
addition that they would have to do?
48, 50 potential
see.
locations, that it would fall within that, and they wouldn't need to go to the community, whether it's a church or a neighborhood
School
or
or-
a school, and ask for a waiver.
So that would make sense, but then the last bullet conflicts with the decision we made earlier.
Right.
That's why I have that little footnote.
Yeah,
It
and
says
so.
Didn't know what we were gonna
outcome of
decide
earlier
earlier.
Right, so
Yeah,
really.
so that one could be
So that
stricken.
one would
Yeah.
need to,
Yeah.
be removed. But then, so help me to understand, when you say first draw, what do you mean exactly?
So let's say we received two applications. One application has a VITA, well, we'll have to pick more than that. It's like 10
Say
applications,
we have 200
right? Or
applications.
200.
Just go back.
Different hats.
Okay,
So one application is just the application, the special land use application.
okay,
Okay, so they can legally submit their application. They're not required to submit a VITA. Okay, so we've received their application. Somebody else comes in and says, I'm willing to do a VITA. I want to do this with the city and in partnership and achieve these outcomes that the city commission's defined. So what it would do is say, okay, well, you're put into this bucket, and the guy who just submitted his application only is put into this bucket. We're first going to pick from the bucket that has the people who really want to work with us and achieve these outcomes. So we're going to draw numbers, sorting numbers, priority order of where they're going to be on the Planning Commission agenda. Okay? So as you do that, as they're selected, then that 2,000-foot separation distance, if they're applying, let's say, for a provisioning center, starts to kick in. So there's an incentive to want to do a VITA because you may have just submitted an application, but you may get excluded or not be eligible anymore because now the 2,000-foot radius is set in for the first dispensary owner who submitted a VITA.
okay, so then if I may? So if, as I'm looking at the multiple bullets here, all of them can't be a priority.
Right.
So are these bullets here then for us to select? But if we already made the decision that the VITA would provide exactly what you just described, didn't we make the decision about who would be in that first draw? That's one question. Then the second question is, if we have a pool of applicants who all fall, who are, well, half of them have the VITA and half do not, then why wouldn't we then look at all of those applicants and go through Planning Commission? Why would, I mean, is it because of the quantity? And then we would be like the state where they're approving, what, is it 30 every time they meet or something like that?
I think.
I think it has to do with the setback requirements, that like
So where you start.
When one becomes established, it could eliminate people down the line.
Affects the whole.
But I think, so I guess, so if the two of us are doing the exact same thing,
And
down the street from each other, and we both have Vitas, then who goes first?
That's why there's the random draw.
Right.
To determine who gets to go first, and if you're first and you get it, then it could, I mean.
Yeah, and other communities have wrestled with this too, because this is where you have run into issues where people are trying to do everything they can to get at the front of the line. And so having a process that takes away potential problems and ambiguity and creates a fair playing field. Other communities have done the same thing. They have done this random draw, and then once one is approved, that impacts the other potential locations for the applications. And that is why this is a little bit more challenging, but why how you select is important. And so if we have priorities like the VITA and other priorities that will get an application up to the first draw, that is an incentive for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it almost feels like, the VITA,
Multiple properties as well.
sure, and it almost feels like the VITA should be unpacked so that elements that would be within the VITA would be qualifiers for the order of the bucket that they're in, if that makes sense.
Yes, and so in other words, you're talking about like tiered.
So then-
Tiered VITA results.
Yes.
That's right.
Absolutely, there has to be. You can't check one thing on the VITA list and get the same amount of priority as someone who's got 10. So
Okay.
that's something, so, you know, and those are the details we need to work out.
Okay.
But this is just a hybrid example of sort of combining the randomness with preference for those who are willing to work with us.
Okay.
But
So-
yes, there should be tiers, and we need to figure that out.
Okay.
And so my understanding is, part of this conversation today is for us to give Suzanne some direction and parameters so that then she can start to work through those details to bring back. And obviously, they'll have to be reviewed by the Planning Commission as well.
Yeah, I mean,
Is that
for
accurate?
this, we wanted to first kind of discuss this concept with you, to see if this makes sense.
Some people freaked out when they heard lottery.
Yes.
I mean, when that was in the
Yes.
press, I'm sure all of us got contacted by people. Many people were very upset about this, and
Yep.
so this is an important conversation that we have.
Yes.
And before I forget, can I ask about the form? We still need guidance on the form. Like, are you okay with us developing a standardized, objective pick list for use as part of this application process?
With a few things on it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
with
the
just a
VITA.
few
Yeah,
things on it.
I couldn't
Sorry,
remember
VITA,
other
but
cities who have done that, but I know that other cities have done that, and quite frankly, we've talked about that at length too, is how do
Creating
we
the
learn
menu, and
from
it's
other
essentially the
communities?
same thing as a VITA, but, you know, depending on what you want to call it, it's
Any
the,
benefit,
it's
it's
the boxes that they check. Are you comfortable
Prioritize.
with us preparing a list based on the feedback we've received today?
Yes, I am. I think, and of course, we can respond to that before it's finalized, but I'm comfortable with that. Commissioner Jones?
Yeah, Suzanne, in place of, or have we seen in other parts of the country that instead of a drawing and/or a lottery, there was instead a scoring and like a targeted criteria system?
There is. Yeah,
Okay.
there are some communities that have done that. It's not as legally defensible. I mean, I should let the attorneys talk, but they've run into issues, and it does leave for more discretion and bias, I think, in how you do the points. And it takes, it's a lot, depending on the volume that you get. So
I missed the question, Commissioner Jones. Can you repeat it? I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
I was wondering if in other communities, if we've seen examples where in place of a drawing and a lottery, they instead have a scoring and a targeted criteria system?
Okay.
Which I've read some of those cases as well, where there's been challenge, and then there's been,
But the lottery's been challenged too, correct? Or is that, so you're saying that's more defensible than the?
Well, I think Tom can respond. They did the research.
Yeah, so the more objective we can make it, the more legally defensible it becomes. When we start making subjective calls on those type of things, and then also there was a Sixth Circuit case out of Ohio, but it was in our circuit, that defended the use of a draw being the most objective. You know, it said, yeah, in lieu of having people line up for 4 weeks and having people bargaining with each other and having people be at risk of crime or whatever, a good alternative that's objective is a draw. So that's why we landed on that option.
So, Commissioners, are you comfortable with Suzanne and Jessica working on a list that incorporates our priorities that we talked about today, but also can look at examples like Battle Creek and others and give something back to us to respond to?
Yeah, Landon was saying, like, when we looked at Battle Creek, they didn't have a focus on equity. They were looking.
They really don't, but we can work some of those in. I mean, we'll do our best. It's pretty, theirs is pretty plain vanilla land use, so from a lawyer standpoint, we like how defensible it is, but it includes things like improved aesthetics, increased energy efficiency and design, impacts to city services, low impact to adjacent property values. That might be something that falls within the scope of our discussion, and then reusing buildings, and so efficient use of property. But we could take those items and then add the things that we've talked about today. And what we like about it primarily is the format, that the person goes through, makes their selection, they acknowledge that it's voluntary, but that once they check the box, it's going to become a condition to their approval. So we like how that all came together, that format. Now theirs is different too because they have a regulatory ordinance as well, so that's a discussion for a whole nother day. But they're not just doing it through zoning.
I would like to put it back out there. I've had this in private conversations, but I'm wondering about the legality of if we go the route of a lottery system or drawing, if we can somehow set it up in a way that's similar to I use the NBA draft lottery as an example. The teams that have the worst records are provided with more ping pong balls to choose from. And perhaps one could have more ping pong balls based on the criteria or the way in which they are in alignment with what we have with regards to our VITA.
Right, and I think that's what Commissioner Lanier was getting at in terms of sort of like layering, I hate to use the word points, but the value of the VITA that you submit.
Okay.
And what you said is that if there's a VITA that has 1 versus 7 checks, the 7, and maybe it's just a matter of creating more tiers, right? Maybe we have 7 tiers, and if you have 7 of the VITA elements versus 3, you're in 1 versus 4.
It's a higher tier. Yeah, you could have a range of, and in this case, to the residency question, you know, if they live in a neighborhood or they own a business in a neighborhood of focus or they're a resident of a neighborhood of focus, we had selected the general target area because we felt that was a commonly understood geographic area that had all the wards, and it meets the federal requirements and is generally locations where, you know, persons who are low income live and other things. So we thought that could be a possibility. But then you would have the highest tier with the most things that you want, right? And then your second tier, maybe it's 3 out of the 5, and then 1 of the 5, or, you know, whatever. There could be multiple tiers to the process.
Commissioner Jones, does that sound like what you were trying to accomplish, like along the same lines?
Yeah.
Does it? Okay. Okay. Commissioner Kelly?
Yeah, I just have a question about, we haven't seen what's up there yet, but I suspect a lot of it is around jobs and hiring and so on. What can we do around local hiring legally? And I was thinking, for example, could we say that we are, you know, preference for Grand Rapids Public School graduates?
I hate to opine on the spot on something that complicated, but I think that, again, in this context, where all we're doing is giving you priority in the application process, and you still have to meet all of the other land use requirements.
Right.
I think we can do a lot with local preferences, including hiring. I asked you your question about, did you say?
Grand Rapids Public Schools, I just threw that out
Right,
there as an
okay,
option.
okay. I don't know that we'd want to be that specific, but
Or local schools.
we do think we can do something with local hiring preferences, yes.
Okay.
Mayor.
Unless
to
they
know
put it in
what.
the general fund and I haven't seen it yet. Oh, you did? Okay.
Well, and again, I'll repeat what I said. I appreciate the thoughts about general fund, but I do think we need to be thoughtful and not get ahead of ourselves on that.
The only reason we even thought about that is because we wanted to, leave you on an optimistic note about those things you couldn't accomplish as prerequisites. And also, a lot of the articles that are out there about states where they're either generating tax revenue or doing some things that we aren't able to do under Michigan law. And those are expenditures that are occurring after the money hits their general fund. So just an important distinction to make, that's all.
Yeah. And being able to capture what that amount will be.
Right.
We also thought, I thought it would be useful for that general fund list, and maybe I'll have Kristen just read them to you about what made which bucket, but there'll be an upcoming discussion that's been scheduled with Kent County. And Kent County gets some revenue as part of this.
Yeah.
And so the discussion about what partnerships might exist with Kent County, and so knowing your expectations in advance of where those opportunities might be or what your goals might be, we thought would be beneficial to at least have that in mind as we approach that discussion.
And Suzanne, remind me, for the funds that go to the county, are they designated specifically to Sheriff's Department, or does it go to their general fund?
Medical marijuana, it changes with recreational. So medical marijuana, it goes both to the county general fund as well as a portion to the sheriff.
That's
There's
what I
two
thought.
different categories.
And then is the sheriff, I mean, clearly, we're the only community, the only city that will be allowing medical marijuana. So will the funds that go to the sheriff, will there be a direct
Township has one growth facility.
connection in them serving our city at some capacity?
I think that would be a good topic of discussion.
Okay. All right.
So, I mean, that's the question, because it doesn't say to the city police force, it
Right.
says to the county sheriff.
Yeah.
Well, the county sheriff's not serving our city, but they're getting all the revenue that's coming out of our city. That's I think a good thing to discuss.
Yeah.
So this list that we wanted also will serve that dual purpose of being able to help us inform that discussion in the future.
Okay. All right.
So if we can, because I want to be respectful of your time, maybe have Kristen respond back, and there's 3 other items that we wanted to cover. 2 should be very quick, and then the third I wanted to make sure we're clear on community engagement.
So a few of you were really interested in living wage. Unfortunately, that's a sad-faced note. We really can't deal with living wage or in controlling charges or leasing of rents. That's really a no-no under state law. One commissioner put something about the city should be in control of the MMFLA rules and be able to affecting policies. Some of that I think is lobbying the state. Some of that might be a regulatory ordinance, but really we are kind of limited by the MMFLA. So when we look at the general fund, there is going to be some overlap. I think a couple things can be discussed in the VITA and the general fund, but the talk for later would be things like we can consider economic developments for owners, entrepreneurs, local ownership hiring. Look at that later. Support for education, about the dangers of edibles. Oh, I got yelled at, thank you. Economic development for owners or entrepreneurs, local hiring, support on education to minors on the sort of dangers of edibles, supporting sort of minority entrepreneurs, affordable housing fund, lead abatement, mental health services, employment opportunities, job training came up a couple times, MLBE strategy. A lot of these can be discussed in the general fund when we kind of get to that time to talk about that. In terms of the VITA for right now, you'll see, again, these are coming up kind of twice. So MLBE strategy, MLBE contracting, that's things we can look at for the VITA. Energy goals for growers, manufacturers, transports, that's actually what Battle Creek does now in their pick list. And then local preference, local ownership of hiring, and persons living in underserved geographical areas that are sort of owners. These are sort of what we think we can look at in developing some parameters right now. And then some of these things we might be able to further explore later, and some of these things are definitely a talk for later.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, Suzanne?
Okay.
By the way, can we get a copy of the regulatory ordinance that you're talking about in Battle Creek, or regulatory? I'd just like to see that. I had not heard of that before.
We can provide that to you. So this is commencement of separation distance effect from other marijuana uses. So this one is a little bit strange, and it's because when we do a special land use approval, it goes into effect 16 days following the decision, because it leaves a window open for appeal.
Yep.
So if there's somebody, the planning commission approves, somebody doesn't like it, they can appeal it to the Board of Zoning Appeals. Because of the separation distances and when that effective date happens is really important, because, for example, the planning commission meets every 2 weeks. Well, we got a 16-day appeal process. So we've got these windows. So we're expecting, the issue that we have is that some communities, in this case Battle Creek, adopted a provisional approval upon acceptance of a complete application to reduce the uncertainty for applicants. And then what they do is they actually update their website and say, okay, they're provisionally approved. It's kind of like a temporary stay almost until they're formally approved. And they do that because then you don't have this gap where you've got this confusing period in time about whether or not you're in limbo. Is it effective, or can somebody else come in that's less than that separation distance and also get approved? So some of our decisions are whether or not we adopt an ordinance separate from zoning, which would allow a provisional buffer as an interim step, adopt an ordinance or policy restricting applications within a required separation distance that would be enforced as soon as an application is accepted, before an approval is granted and effective, or no change. So really, no change should not be an option. But so we can either do a separate provisional ordinance, or we can do something where we say in the zoning, as soon as this is approved, we're now setting forth this buffer. So maybe that's more of a staff question than asking you how it works, but we wanted to make you aware of that. So if it came to you, you were familiar with it. So it's more of an awareness, I think, piece. Okay. But I didn't know if you have any comment on that or any thoughts.
Commissioner's thoughts? I mean, to me, the number one seems the cleanest, in my opinion.
Yep.
I think that's fair to applicants. Commissioners, any other comments on that?
Okay.
Okay.
The other one that will be coming up, we have the fee application, or the application fee that we will be collecting as part of submittals. But we also know that because of the separation distances, when those hit, that not everyone will be able to have a full application in front of the Planning Commission. So the recommendation here will be, we'll come back to you with an administrative policy amendment for zoning fee refunds, so that we are refunding applicants' monies for extracting, what it took for us to review it and whatever, prioritize it. But beyond that, we wouldn't be incurring any additional costs. So we want to make sure that we're respectful and that we be giving back those fees of that portion where we did not conduct any work for.
I think that's fair.
Okay.
So just,
and then finally, sorry,
Commissioner Kelly had a question.
well, I can wait with this question. Go ahead.
Okay.
Any questions about the fee? That if it doesn't move forward, of course we should give it back. I mean,
Okay, and then the last question for discussion for today is community engagement. So in front of you, I don't have it to put on the screen because it wasn't reading well and it was quite small. It provided you with a timeline, and just basically wanted to talk through with you what your expectations were for engagement, so we could have a more clear process in mind when we're talking to the neighborhoods and businesses, neighborhood and business associations, as well as industry interests and anybody else who wants to contact us about it. So the table that's in front of you is broken into really two parts, VITA and ordinance amendments. The VITA, we had our discussion today, and then we'll be coming back to you both with that policy as well as the application policy. It might be one policy that has both components in it. We've talked about that as well. So we will be bringing back policies to you anticipating on November 13th. And the question would be whether or not you'd want to have a public hearing on those policies that we would be creating in response to today's discussion and additional review in November. So that's the first question.
So this is community engagement just about the process and moving forward. I was under the impression you were asking about community engagement for the actual applications, but that's all spelled out through special land use, and the Good Neighbor Plan will be incorporated into that process.
Correct.
Okay. Yep. So this, so Commissioners, what's before us is just our plan and timeline for approval, and are we comfortable with a more condensed process, or do we want to ensure that there's community engagement, knowing how? Well, I'll just open it up. So take a moment to look at the difference between the two. Commissioner Kelly?
Yeah, I'm always going to go in favor of some community engagement. This is a huge change for this community, and I also think that you are going to need time to deal with all this, so the whole community engagement does engage you. But I do want to hear back from the public.
Okay, Commissioner Parker?
But it's just really community engagement about the VITA. Is that's the way it's framed here? Is that?
So the first question is, will you want, when you have your city commission policies, will you want to have public hearings about it? Or you can just adopt your policy, but are you going to want public hearings on your policy decisions? So that's the first part. The other
part.
In this case, for example, when we have an item and it gets down into the ordinance amendments, when we have something that comes to Planning Commission, the Planning Commission holds the public hearing for the ordinance amendment. When it comes to City Commission, you have discretion as to whether or not you want to hold a public hearing because the Planning Commission's already held one.
Right.
And so, but sometimes if it's a contentious item or there's a lot of neighborhood concern, you'll hold your own public hearing on top of the Planning Commission public hearing. When we look at that, then that adds about a month to the timeline. So that's why I'm asking, just to manage expectations so that you know the cadence of the approval process and the community knows where they'll have an opportunity to voice any concerns.
And, you know, I think the difficult thing is sometimes we set a public hearing after we read the Planning Commission minutes and we hear feedback from folks who attended that meeting.
Sure.
And so I think that's sometimes we're comfortable not having a public hearing if we thought there was ample public comment during the Planning Commission. On the flip side, some of us have voiced concerns that people aren't able to get to a Planning Commission meeting because they start during the day, where our meetings are at 7 o'clock at night, and we're more accessible for public comment. So I think we've all wrestled with this in the past of whether to have an additional public hearing after Planning Commission versus just go with the public.
But we're not having a public hearing about opting in. We're having a public hearing about this VITA, which is like what community benefits we want to see happen for it. So that to me doesn't seem like as important. It's not as controversial anyway.
Well,
but.
no, however, I think that there's a perception out there that neighborhoods are going to have an opportunity to weigh in. So if nothing else, I think maybe at one of Stacy's meetings, they need to hear what we heard today, and that is that we really have to streamline this. And we can't, spend all this time with each neighborhood and figuring this out. But I'm afraid there's a perception out there that we need to correct.
And I think one of the things that's hard about this is there's only so much as just the VITA and the general operating fund discussion pointed out. There's only so many things you can do.
Right.
And I think that's the difficulty, and it's more of an education process.
But I would also say that we're embarking on new territory with a VITA.
Yeah.
And I would prefer to have some community engagement around that. There may be ideas that none of us thought about, and I know some of you have met with individuals locally. They may have some additional feedback after our discussion today.
Well, if that's the case, fine, but I think that they also have to hear what we heard today.
Right. And be informed. No, that's a good point. Commissioner Lanier?
So I'm looking at your application date, Suzanne, with the options you have here in front of us. And one of them is beyond the existing moratorium that the commission voted on a couple weeks ago.
And that one assumes that you'd have immediate effect. I mean, there's questions about whether or not you do immediate effect, because that would add on time.
Right.
Yep.
Is there not an option 3?
And
I mean, sorry, go ahead, Commissioner Linear.
so, I'm looking at this and I can't help but to reflect on our conversation from 2 weeks ago. And the need to not make a decision about a moratorium until we had enough information in front of us. Because if we make a decision, so we had already made a decision, then we made another decision, and now we have something in front of us saying there's yet a different date.
That's the
in
same
which we
date that
would-
was there 2 weeks ago, April 2nd.
Yeah.
This is
I
the
didn't
same
think
sh-
so.
It's the same
I
sheet
thought it
she gave
was.
us.
No,
2
the
weeks ago.
application it was January. The date for accepting applications was January
For
for the
option one.
moratorium.
January
Yeah,
22nd, that'd be
yeah.
for option 1.
This
This is
same
exactly
chart
the
was
same.
shared.
But what you all voted on was for the January 22nd.
Well, they voted for 6 months.
Right, from which date?
From September 17th, 18th?
Which takes us through till
Maybe do math.
October.
September to October, October,
March.
November, December.
So it does take us to the March
March.
date.
So
Yeah,
the
to
April,
March.
so the April 2nd date is a different, this April 2nd date seems like a different date than what your moratorium spoke to last time. No.
I think we had this
You
exact
had the same
chart.
information.
Okay, okay, I was gonna say, I thought it was a March date we were talking about.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the difference between the effective date and the application date. Maybe that's the
Yeah, you could, I
difference
mean,
that
you
I'm speaking
could,
of.
the blue, City Commission second reading adoption, so February 26th. So you could vote if the attorney is comfortable with immediate effect, and that would put it ahead of the moratorium expiration
So
date.
then, why are we talking about this again if these are the same dates?
Because we want to anticipate what you are expecting from a process to be able to say, this is where the community can have a voice, where they can show up and talk to the city commission, or they can talk to the planning commission. For example, for us, with the ordinance language, now we've discussed the ordinance language. If we are expected to go out and talk to neighborhood and business associations about the ordinance and the changes, then that changes when we would go to the planning commission with the ordinance. So on the blue portion, if you see ordinance amendments and you see corridor improvement district outreach, neighborhood information meetings, that's in November. If there wasn't a lot of dialogue that we needed to have with those groups, or we thought, well, the city commission, you're comfortable with everything, we're just going to move it through, then instead of, we could either choose to have the planning commission meeting November 8th or December 13th, depending if we wanted to spend the month of November going out and getting additional feedback.
So this conversation really is about changing the decision that was made with the moratorium to having the decision to be made earlier than what was allotted with the 6 months moratorium.
Well,
No, that's not my understanding. I think the city manager wants to
Yeah, I'm just trying to
jump in.
understand why we're talking about something if we made a decision before, is it because we're trying to then give the opportunity for this to be done prior to the March date?
I just want to make sure that you're comfortable that we've reached out to the community and that we've got the input that you're comfortable with, or you feel that you've made the decision and we're good there because there's only so much we can do.
To me, my memory of the conversation about the moratorium was to allow us time to figure out not just some of these decisions we made today, but the process moving forward and what level of community engagement we want, and making sure that we had an opportunity for that based on the level of changes or decisions that we were making. And so this is really just providing a couple opportunities and giving direction to the staff about, yes, we want you to go out in the community, and we want to make sure that people are this is very, very confusing to a lot of people, and a lot of people who've been paying attention still are struggling to understand what this means for them and their neighborhood.
Yep.
And so the two different options provide time to do some of that work. So, city manager?
Yep, thank you, Mayor. I think if I could reframe just what the ask is and not so much stick to the timeline per se, because I think the Commissioner's point about the moratorium is good. I mean, it's not that much difference between March and the beginning of April. But the question is, what is the optimal level of community engagement that we really need to be comfortable? And both from a staff perspective as well as commission perspective. And do we want to have a public hearing in front of the commission about the VITA criteria? Because I think, to me, in hearing the conversation, understanding what the conversations involved are the concerns around equity, that really is the VITA discussion. I mean, we've shortened it for VITA, WITA, whatever the content, but it's really it's equitable development agreement, not just about any community benefit agreement. Mm-hmm. So I think if we can just hear from staff, and from our preference, is to optimize the amount of engagement. And the question is, do we want to do that in front of the commission and have that discussion, or outside the commission, and we'll come back and make the dates work within at least the first shot of making it work within the moratorium?
Yeah, yes, correct.
So Commissioners, thank you. That provides some clarity. So the question before us is, what direction do we want to give the planning department to go out and do community engagement? And as you said, a significant portion of that is education, even walking them through. I think even since we passed this ordinance, we have all learned a lot, mm-hmm. But even walking them through the clarifications that we made today. So what's your preference? Where do we fall on this? What's the mind of the commission, so that we can give some feedback to the planning commission, or planning department, I should say. Commissioner Kelly errs on the side of community engagement. Let's make sure that people fully understand this and have an opportunity to weigh in.
I think I go for option one, but I like the idea of a public hearing, which maybe changes it slightly. But
and Suzanne, do we need to like commit to this today, or if we, as I said, if we hear from the public during the planning commission conversation and we say we do want to add a public hearing, we have the freedom to do that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure, because I know sometimes we talk about community engagement, and defining what community engagement is for something like this sometimes is a challenge. And so I just wanted to make sure that we're totally open and flexible to whatever you want to do. I just want to say there's a couple steps in there about decision points about when we have public hearings and at what point we engage the community in this. And so I just wanted to put that in front of you, just so you understood the timeline, but understood that there's some steps in there. And I will say, based on our neighborhood meeting that we had last week, we talked a lot about the Good Neighbor Plan with the neighborhoods. So there's other components that we're already engaging the neighborhoods with on it, and they're viewing really right now the VITA being the work of the City Commission and the Good Neighbor Plan being their work. And they've asked staff to help them with developing a template that they could use when they're approached. So we're working with them on a template and how that could go. And we've also had additional requests for neighborhood meetings, for example, from NECA. So we've talked about having maybe a joint evening neighborhood meeting for residents to come out as well. And so we'll continue that dialogue with them and give you feedback on when they think they want to also interject. I think that would be beneficial. But I just wanted to know if there was any particular concern or interest that you had for level of engagement. So that's really that simple.
I mean, for me, I prefer for the VITA option 2, the community engagement, but I'm fine with the ordinance amendments being condensed.
Okay, perfect.
I mean, that's where I'm falling. That I think we should be able to maybe come up with an option 3, quite frankly, but also know that if we feel after hearing from the Planning Commission that we need to add a public hearing, we have the ability to do that.
That's very helpful.
Commissioners, any other comments? Commissioner Lanier?
So when would we come back to this body with some of the questions that we have or some of the feedback we've given? When would we reconvene to have that discussion, and how does it fit in this timeline you have here? And I do want to go back after this to the fee refund.
Yeah.
because that one happened a little bit too fast for me, and I want to go back to, there's something I want to add to that.
So we would anticipate we'll come back on November 13th. Because you'll
Okay.
have one meeting before, and by the time you prepare an agenda item and all comes through, we want to give us time to prepare something thoughtful for you that you'll be able to react to. So
Okay.
we're anticipating November 13th, at that meeting, we come back, and then you'll have additional discussion. This doesn't mean that you have to adopt it by December 20, or November 27th or December 18th. You still have time with the ordinance, because that will still be in process, going through all the public hearing with the Planning Commission and that agenda. So you do have more flexibility with the VITA and your commission policies, but that's why I wanted to start off with the ordinance piece, so we knew where we were at with that.
And is November 13th a commission day, so would it be on COW, or would we do another work session?
It's up to the preference of the commission.
Yeah, my preference would be Cal.
Oh, okay.
Commissioner?
I mean, option one, I feel like, again, the moratorium's in place, you guys passed that already, and I feel like we've already kicked the can down the road, and we're just gonna wait till recreational marijuana passes in November, and we're gonna kick the can again. So just, let's make some decisions, let's give people access to the medicine that they need. Like, we're talking about a public hearing for something that we're providing additional community benefits for, like, we're doing all the right things. At some point, people have to trust the fact that we've made the rational decision to allow medical marijuana in our community. We've been thoughtful about it. We're doing the right things. We're not trying, like, we're having a work session in public on camera today to talk about this. We are being completely transparent about what we're doing. Like, let's make some decisions and move on and let this happen. And then in the event that recreational does pass and we have to react, we can react at a later date and make changes to all of it rather than, again, I think we're just going to find a way to kick the can down the road again.
Well,
Right?
Commissioner, I disagree with you. We're not kicking the can. We made a number of
Feel good at that,
decisions
though.
today, and we have a plan in place to move forward, not just with the VITA, but with the ordinance changes. And if we feel the need to allow an opportunity for the public to weigh in, we can make that decision. But clearly, we have a plan, whether it is in January, February, or March, we'll have this adopted. We've all said that we need to be thoughtful and sensitive to the needs of our community, and I think this shows that we're doing that. All right, any other comments or questions? Commissioner Jones?
Just real quick.
Final thought?
Yeah, I heard my colleague, Commissioner Rephart, he was in favor of option one, and wanted to make sure that we had a public hearing. That, as I read it, we would have a public hearing both for the VITA as well as for the ordinance amendments, correct? With option one.
Option one, you would not have a public hearing with the ordinance amendments. You would have we could certainly have it with the VITA and maintain the timeline.
I got you. Okay. Gotcha. Okay.
But to Mayor Bliss's point, we could wait and see what happens at Planning Commission and the kind of feedback that we get. And also in our work with the neighborhoods and see if there's any concerns expressed between now and then, now that we have some policy direction from you, and see where that lands and find out if it's necessary.
So the VITA is going to come back before us on November 13th.
Yep.
And so we could decide at that moment to schedule a public hearing before it's adopted.
You sure could. Yep.
That could be a part of our discussion that day when it's before us at COW. Is everyone good with that?
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
So next steps, I just laid that out for you, it's up on the board, but ordinance revisions, we'll work on those and provide those to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission will hold a public hearing. We will not draft a parks waiver process. Now that we have the direction on that, we'll work on the marijuana application processing in combination with the VITA, a revised zoning, the zoning fees. I know Commissioner Leary wanted to talk a little bit about that, as well as draft ordinance for provisional approval for separation distances. And then we'll also continue to work on a timeline with anticipated effective and application dates for review. So this input helps us do that. As we mentioned, with with keeping the parks waiver in there and having it come to City Commission first, we will have to leave some time between the effective date of the ordinance and the application for the Planning Commission. To address Commissioner Lanier's question for zoning refunds, right now there's a City Commission policy that describes how much we can refund for an applicant. And following the Bolt decision, we can only charge what it costs us to be able to do. And so if an applicant isn't going all the way through the process, the current cap that's in the policy is too low to acknowledge the fee that we would be charging. And so it's just kind of truing up the fee that we'd be collecting with the amount of staff effort involved in an application that won't advance.
So right now, the application fee is it $6,500?
In this case, the application fee is $5,000, which is what we are allowed to charge.
Under state law.
And so we also talked a little bit about looking at ways in which, and I don't remember whose idea this was, but we talked about, how do we waive the application fee for, again, local preference? That there was some conversation about that, or reduce the fee or something like that. So are you saying that the $5,000 is what it cost for the city to process the application, the staffing and all of that?
For all around this subject, if I put all of the work effort that's gone into being able to facilitate this, it's well over $5,000 per application.
So then why don't we have a higher application fee?
Because it's capped by state law.
Yeah.
Okay.
The MMFLA caps, and in the recreational language also caps, the most that a local jurisdiction can collect is $5,000.
So then that seems like competing language. You can't cap more than what it requires of your staff to do the work, but then we're gonna put a cap on you that doesn't cover what it takes for your staff to do the work?
Yes, ma'am.
Unfunded
Unfunded
mandates. Remember those?
So you
from
can
school
come to
board?
Lansing with us next time we go, and we can have this conversation.
So is that application fee non-refundable?
So what this allows is for us to provide a refund if they don't go all the way through the process. So there are portions of it, as in all of our cases for all of our fees, there is work effort involved even if they're not successful in getting approval.
Now,
So
is that going to be a total refund or a percentage of the refund?
it would be a percentage.
So that revised administration policy will be done between now and then.
So I had one other question,
Yep.
Mayor, that I was holding.
Final question, and then we're going to adjourn.
Yeah, that was
At
just
this
about.
3-hour work session.
Yes, so this is for the attorneys, I'm sure. But if once this is all set and the business is moving right along and somebody buys it, are all these requirements, they'll stay in place, correct? On transfer or sale?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it. I know it was a long day, but this has been very, very helpful for us.
Thanks, and thanks to the entire team who's, I know, working overtime on this, so thank you. Thanks. All right, Commissioners, we are adjourned. We'll be back in here in an hour and a half for our city manager swearing-in ceremony.